Beneath the endless skies of Alaska, where jagged peaks meet icy waters, there exists a region where travellers, pilots, and explorers have vanished without a trace.
Alaska 261, say again. Circle pitch. Alaska 261, say again, sir. Alaska 261, say condition. Alaska 261, are you here with us yet, sir?
Swallowed by forests, glaciers, or the vast shadowed depths of lakes and rivers. In this expanse, known to some as the Alaskan Triangle, ordinary journeys can turn inexplicably perilous, and even the most prepared expeditions encounter the limits of human understanding. Follow the faint traces left by missing survey teams, pilots, and adventurers as their final movements emerge in fragmented reports and fading transmissions, and listen to the strange signals and distress calls that vanish without reply, revealing the unsettling gaps where evidence should exist. Each disappearance carries its own chilling footprint, yet together they reveal a pattern of mystery woven into the very landscape, an invisible thread linking mountain passes, frozen rivers, and hidden waters in a riddle that continues to defy explanation. The vanishing of Congressman Hale Boggs. The autumn air over Anchorage in October 1972 carried a kind of thin, crystalline quiet that seemed to settle over everything. The sky stretched wide and pale above the runways as small aircraft prepared for their daily crossings into the interior. It was a familiar scene in a state defined by distance, where flight replaced highways and where long stretches of wilderness lay between any two towns. The morning appeared ordinary to those moving through the airport, yet within hours it would be tied to one of the most enduring disappearances within the region, now called the Alaskan Triangle. Only after the day began to darken did the full weight of the situation emerge, revealing how Congressman Hale Boggs, along with Representative Nick Begich, Aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don John, had vanished somewhere between Anchorage and Juneau. There had been nothing unusual about the plan that morning. The Cessna 310 was scheduled to carry the group southeast across the mountain ranges that cut through the state like frozen waves, and for an aircraft of that type, the route was entirely manageable. Don Yonts was an experienced Alaska pilot, familiar with the volatile conditions that could build over the Chugach and the Gulf of Alaska, while Boggs and Begich were accustomed to the demands of travel in this vast landscape. The purpose of the flight was straightforward, a campaign event in Juneau that required their presence. Nothing in their preparations hinted at the turmoil that would soon follow, with later investigators unable to determine whether weather, mechanical failure, or something altogether different had unfolded over the wilderness. The aircraft lifted off from Anchorage sometime after noon, climbing into a sky that held its usual ambiguity. Weather reports later reviewed by search authorities suggested that light snow showers and pockets of low clouds were scattered along parts of the route. Still, nothing indicated the kind of severe conditions that would normally ground such a flight. Radar coverage in Alaska at the time was sparse, particularly once an aircraft left the main corridors near Anchorage. Once the Cessna moved beyond those monitored paths, it effectively entered a realm where the land swallowed signals and the mountains absorbed echoes. In this space, where valleys curved away into uninhabited reaches and wind patterns shifted abruptly, a missing aircraft could easily remain unseen even from a short distance. The first sign of trouble came in the form of silence. No distress calls were recorded from the Cessna, no partial transmissions, and no mechanical warnings were intercepted. The flight simply failed to arrive in Juneau. When it became clear that the aircraft was overdue, the search that followed grew rapidly into one of the greatest efforts in American history at that time. For 39 days, search teams from the Air Force, Coast Guard, and Civil Air Patrol combed the suspected flight path, covering more than 32,000 square miles of the Chugach Range, Prince William Sound, and the winding fjords that stretched toward the southeast. Aircraft swept low through valleys, sonar scanned the water, and ground teams pushed into the rugged backcountry on foot. Yet not a single piece of wreckage emerged from those weeks of effort. What puzzled investigators most was that even the broadest possibilities failed to produce answers. A mechanical failure severe enough to disable the Cessna would likely have caused some form of debris field, yet none was ever found. A controlled landing on snow or ice, rare but not impossible, would have left some trace even meltwater could not fully erase. A mid-air breakup would have scattered fragments across a visible radius, particularly along slopes that later thawed in spring. Each scenario was evaluated and re-evaluated, but none matched the complete absence of evidence. The wilderness between Anchorage and Juneau is immense, yet officials remained struck by how an aircraft the size of a Cessna 310 could vanish in an era when so large a search force was deployed. Theories accumulated in the years that followed, though the public record retained only what could be supported by available information. Some pointed to the severe topography of the Chugach Mountains, where steep walls and deep ravines made aerial searching difficult. Others noted that the weather in Alaska can shift with little warning, cloud banks forming rapidly and obscuring entire valleys moments after they were clear. Pilots have long spoken of downdrafts along this route that can push an aircraft downward faster than engine power can compensate. Even so, those familiar with the disappearance have often observed that the search area was widened repeatedly, extending far beyond the most probable flight path, yet still produced no answers. The disappearance did not register on radar, offered no emergency signal, and left nothing for the thousands involved in the search to find. As the years passed, the disappearance became part of the larger pattern of unusual vanishings within the region, now described as the Alaskan Triangle, a vast zone where countless aircraft, hikers, hunters and boats have disappeared without resolution. Some researchers have pointed to the challenges of navigation in a landscape dominated by magnetic anomalies and unpredictable winds, while others reference the sheer scale of Alaska's wilderness, where distances are immense and human presence is sparse. Within that context, even modern aircraft can become invisible, absorbed into terrain that offers few clues to the untrained eye. Yet the case of Hale Boggs and his companions stands apart, not only because of their national prominence, but also because of the unprecedented search that followed, which failed to locate anything at all. The families of those aboard the Cessna faced the difficult reality that official inquiries could not resolve what had happened. In later congressional records and investigative summaries, the disappearance remained listed as a missing aircraft event without a determination. The Cold War tensions of the 1970s led some to speculate about causes beyond weather or terrain, though no evidence ever supported theories deviating from the official search findings. The Alaskan wilderness, in its vastness and complexity, held all answers and withheld them at the same time. For those examining the case decades later, the absence of physical evidence remained the central mystery, a reminder that even heavily searched regions can hide entire aircraft for generations. Today, the flight path between Anchorage and Juneau is still travelled by small aircraft navigating the narrow passes and dramatic elevations of the coastal ranges. Pilots flying the route sometimes mention the Boggs disappearance in hushed tones, not as a legend but as a caution tied to the landscape itself. The terrain has changed little since 1972, with towering peaks, deep ice-filled basins, and valleys that twist into uninhabited expanses. Even with improved technology, modern search and rescue professionals acknowledge that Alaska holds spaces where wreckage can remain hidden indefinitely. The silence surrounding the Boggs flight persists because nothing has disrupted it for more than 50 years, allowing speculation to fill the spaces where facts end. Somewhere along that forgotten stretch of sky, a vanishing still lingers in the cold. The missing flight of the Douglas C-54D Skymaster. Morning light filtered through a pale winter haze that softened the sharp lines of Alaska's interior, setting an unusual quiet over the flight corridor used so often by military transports. Snow-dusted ridges and glacial valleys stretched in all directions, remote and largely untravelled, the kind of landscape that demanded respect from anyone moving above it. On January 26, 1950, a Douglas C-54D Skymaster lifted from Anchorage for a routine military transport mission, carrying a crew and passengers whose disappearance would confound searchers for decades. The flight seemed ordinary, the conditions within expected margins for winter aviation, yet the vastness of the route it would traverse foreshadowed how quickly an aircraft could vanish without a trace in Alaska's interior. What should have been a short, controlled journey across mountains and frozen rivers became a mystery that no contemporary technology could resolve. At Elmendorf Air Force Base, ground crews moved with the steady purpose of routine operations as the C-54D Skymaster stood ready for its long journey south. Mechanics ran through standard pre-flight inspections, checking engines, instrumentation and fuel loads, while pilots reviewed the route. Everything indicated readiness. The aircraft was mechanically sound, the crew trained, and the weather deemed marginally safe for transit. In the hubbub of pre-flight activity, no one anticipated that the aircraft would soon disappear from all observation, leaving behind no warning or fragment for investigators. That steady preparation, ordinary in every measurable sense, contrasted sharply with the extraordinary absence that would follow once the flight departed. Only a short time after departure, radio operators noted a routine position report near Snag that would become the final confirmed moment of the Skymaster's flight. Communications ceased immediately afterward. Radar coverage in the region at the time was extremely limited, and once the aircraft moved beyond monitored corridors, it effectively entered a void of observation. In a landscape defined by vast forests, glacier fields, and snow-covered peaks, the aircraft might as well have disappeared into another world. Even the most experienced operators could only log its last known position and then confront the unsettling fact that nothing followed. No distress signals, no emergency calls, no visual contact. Within hours of the aircraft's silence, command centers activated a search protocol that reflected both urgency and the logistical scale of mid-century military coordination. Air Force, Army and Civil Air Patrol units converged on the presumed flight path. Deploying aircraft and teams across an area that spanned thousands of square miles. The operation required careful planning, fuel logistics, weather contingencies, and coordination among multiple agencies all needed to be managed against the clock. Yet despite the rapid and extensive mobilization, searchers were immediately challenged by terrain that offered few vantage points and even fewer natural markers visible from the air. Far beyond the populated edges of Anchorage, the terrain unfolded into vast stretches of forest, broken ridges and narrow valleys that offered little visibility to the aircraft sweeping overhead. Ice-filled rivers and frozen basins reflected muted light, blending mountains into the horizon and making identification of objects nearly impossible. The C-54D could have impacted any slope or glacier, yet the sheer scale of the landscape meant that debris could remain hidden indefinitely. Search teams would later describe a sense of futility, born not from incompetence, but from the sheer immensity and uniformity of the environment. As tracking squads expanded their coverage, pilots described a landscape so uniform in winter colour that even large objects seemed to dissolve into the backdrop. Snowfields stretched for miles without interruption, and cloud cover frequently obscured critical observation points. Even experienced bush pilots familiar with Alaska's quirks remarked on the way natural patterns tricked the eye, hiding slopes, ice formations and depressions. Any wreckage of the Skymaster, had it existed in a visible state, could easily have blended into this monochrome canvas, invisible to both technology and human observers. Investigators reviewing the incident compiled a short list of plausible scenarios grounded in the realities of winter aviation and the limitations of mid-century navigational tools. Mechanical failure, sudden icing, navigational miscalculations, or severe turbulence all remained on the table. Yet no single explanation fully accounted for the complete lack of physical evidence. Flight records, crew experience, and aircraft maintenance logs offered no anomalies. Every theory seemed to explain part of the mystery, but failed to illuminate the full picture, leaving the disappearance as unresolved as the landscape it had crossed. For those waiting beyond Alaska's borders, each day without new information deepened the sense that the Skymaster had slipped into a silence that no official report could resolve. Families, colleagues, and military officials watched as search reports returned empty, each day eroding hope and amplifying questions. The disappearance became more than a lost flight. It became a symbol of the Alaskan interior's capacity to absorb events entirely. People began to sense that this region, defined by its expanses and unpredictable conditions, could conceal even the largest aircraft in total secrecy. In the years that followed, the unanswered questions surrounding the flight became one more entry in the growing record of disappearances connected to the region now known as the Alaskan Triangle. Historians and aviation researchers catalogued the incident alongside other unexplained vanishings, noting the combination of harsh climate, remote geography, and limited mid-century monitoring that contributed to the aircraft's vanishing. Despite decades of speculation, no wreckage, no survivors, and no definitive evidence emerged, leaving the flight suspended in collective memory as a mystery that refused closure. Between the last voice transmission and the frozen wilderness that stretched beneath it, the Skymaster's trail faded into a mystery that has never allowed a single certainty to surface. Karl Heine's final cabin departure. The forest pressed close around the small log cabin, its timbers darkened by years of snow and moisture, offering both shelter and a quiet witness to the events that would soon unfold. Nestled among dense spruce and fir, the cabin sat near a narrow creek whose icy surface reflected the pale winter sun. The surrounding terrain was a patchwork of frozen clearings and tangled underbrush, where even a short journey could become disorienting without careful preparation. Karl Heine, a man familiar with this wilderness, had spent years navigating these forests. Yet, on the day he departed, the landscape seemed to hold him in its hush, as though aware of the vanishing that was about to occur. Neighbours would later note that the area carried an uncanny stillness that morning, an atmosphere that mirrored the uncertainty of his disappearance. Inside, Karl Heine moved with practiced familiarity, checking supplies and tools while noting the subtle shifts of frost along the windowsill and the way the morning light refracted off the icy panes. His preparations were methodical, axes sharpened, provisions packed, stove stoked with remaining wood. He reviewed his intended route mentally, marking landmarks and slopes he could follow if he needed to navigate in low visibility. Each movement was deliberate, consistent with a man who knew the challenges of Alaskan winter travel. Yet even as he secured his gear, a tension lingered in the air, a combination of the harsh environment outside and the imperceptible anomalies of that particular day. When he stepped beyond the threshold that morning, the crisp air carried a stillness that seemed heavier than usual, and his departure marked the beginning of a disappearance that would confound searchers. Footsteps pressed lightly into the fresh snow, leaving a trail that initially appeared orderly and purposeful. The trees muffled sound, and the wind, though slight, shifted constantly, creating illusions of movement and erasing some signs almost immediately. Those first moments, so ordinary in any winter journey, would be the last verified sighting of Karl Heine, and the snow around his cabin would soon betray the absence of continuity in his path. Around the cabin, snow muffled the forest floor, hiding animal tracks and erasing minor disturbances, creating a landscape in which even careful footsteps could vanish without a trace. Small streams, partially frozen, reflected fragmented sunlight, while distant ridges loomed without clear definition, merging into shadowed shapes that made orientation difficult. Any object, including a human figure, could easily blend into these features. Later investigators emphasized that winter in this part of Alaska could transform a familiar path into an untraceable expanse within hours, as snowfalls, wind, and temperature shifts altered even the most obvious terrain markers. Neighbours and occasional hikers later reported signs of his path. A disturbed snowbank here, a partially broken branch there, details that ended abruptly, leaving no further indication of direction. Tracks led to a slope where loose ice and underbrush could obscure further passage, yet no additional footprints, equipment, or signs of struggle appeared beyond this point. Some of these observations came weeks later, when slight thaws allowed searchers to inspect areas that had been initially inaccessible. Each investigation confirmed the same pattern. Heine's movements left clear evidence at first, then vanished entirely into the forest's natural complexity. Hidden pockets of thin ice and snow-covered sinkholes peppered the forest floor along his likely route, creating natural traps that even a cautious traveller could misstep into unnoticed. Investigators later documented that these features were common in the region, particularly during early winter, when freezing temperatures create fragile crusts over waterlogged depressions. Some sinkholes were obscured by fallen branches or snowdrifts, making them nearly invisible to anyone walking above them. Search teams noted that similar formations had complicated previous wilderness rescues, swallowing tracks and even small equipment entirely, and in Heine's case, they may have contributed to the abrupt disappearance of his footprints and other signs of movement. Investigators later considered known hazards of the region, from sudden icefalls to concealed crevasses, all documented possibilities that matched the terrain, yet offered no certainty about what had occurred. Reports indicated that several nearby ravines and steep inclines could conceal a person or small group entirely from view. Experts familiar with Alaskan wilderness survival noted that even minor errors in footing or route selection could result in injury, incapacitation, or death, yet nothing in Heine's preparation suggested he was prone to such mistakes. The absence of corroborating evidence left the case suspended between plausible hazard and inexplicable disappearance. Despite his familiarity with the area and years of experience navigating its challenges, Heine's disappearance demonstrated how quickly even the most knowledgeable traveller could be absorbed by the wilderness. He had previously travelled solo for extended periods, often leaving cabins for hunting or mapping short routes. On this day, however, no sign suggested he reached his intended destination. Search parties combed ridges, valleys, and frozen streams, yet their efforts returned nothing more than the occasional displaced branch or faint disturbance in the snow, artifacts of movement that provided no further insight. Each attempt to reconstruct his route emphasized the forest's capacity to erase human presence. The event became part of a larger record of Alaskan Triangle vanishings, each case contributing to the sense of a remote expanse where ordinary travel could dissolve into uncertainty. Analysts compared Heine's case with other disappearances, noting similarities in terrain, timing, and initial evidence. Whether it was hikers, hunters, pilots, or solitary travelers, the region consistently presented situations where an individual could vanish without a trace. Heine's disappearance reinforced the pattern. Even skill, preparation, and familiarity were insufficient defences against the unpredictability of these remote environments. The cabin remained undisturbed after his departure, its firewood stacked and tools in place, as though waiting silently for the person who would never return. Windows caught light on frost patterns that mirrored nothing beyond the immediate room. The stove, previously stoked, sat cold, and no sign indicated that Heine had returned. It remained a quiet sentinel over the mystery, unaltered by human activity, a tangible marker of absence that would endure long after search teams withdrew. Beyond the last footprint in the snow, the forest holds its secrets close, and the man who walked into its shadows has never been seen again. The Lost Party of Disenchantment Bay. Fog rolled over the jagged edges of Disenchantment Bay, swallowing the shoreline in a pale grey that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the mountains. Ice-laden waters reflected muted light, and distant glaciers appeared as shadowed sentinels along the fjord. The bay's stillness carried a deceptive calm, for its channels could shift with sudden tides and winds, transforming familiar passages into perilous corridors. On the morning of their departure, a party of explorers and local navigators prepared to traverse these waters, unaware that their journey would end in one of the Alaskan Triangle's most enduring mysteries. Reports later documented that their movements, once visible, vanished as abruptly as they had begun, leaving only questions in their wake. The group, composed of experienced sailors and a few explorers less accustomed to Alaska's extremes, gathered their gear along the frozen dock, checking small skiffs, ropes, and provisions. Their experience varied, but all were familiar with the basics of navigating icy waters. Maps were reviewed, and plans for the day were discussed in low tones, while distant echoes of cracking ice reminded them of the region's unpredictability. Even in preparation, the environment imposed a subtle tension, as though the bay itself waited to test their skill and resolve. Each individual understood the stakes, yet none could foresee how swiftly normal routines could dissolve into uncertainty. Their initial departure was marked by careful navigation between ice-laden waters and narrow channels, the hulking glaciers looming like silent sentinels over their path. The skiffs moved slowly, cutting through partially frozen bays, while occasional icebergs tilted and scraped the water with muffled sounds. The explorers maintained sight of one another, passing landmarks with deliberate precision. Yet despite their attentiveness, the fog and uneven lighting obscured small details and masked depth, creating illusions that challenged perception. The bay's scale seemed limitless, and each ripple or shadow hinted at unseen obstacles. As the afternoon settled, sudden gusts funneled through the fjords, carrying flakes of ice and snow that blurred visibility and transformed familiar routes into disorienting passages. Currents twisted unexpectedly, pushing smaller skiffs off their intended courses. The explorers found themselves compensating for hidden shoals and submerged ice, their movements becoming reactive rather than confident. The weather's capricious nature was documented in later reports, which noted rapid temperature swings and shifting winds as characteristic hazards of the bay. Even under experienced guidance, these conditions could obscure the most basic indicators of directional position. Observers on shore later recounted seeing small skiffs bobbing irregularly against the tide, movements that seemed deliberate yet ultimately unresolved as the party disappeared from view. Some described fleeting glimpses of figures adjusting sails or scanning the horizon, only for the fog to consume them again. Official logs confirm these brief sightings, though no subsequent contact or visual confirmation occurred beyond this point. The evidence, fragmentary and fleeting, provided little to guide searchers or reconstruct the party's intended path, emphasizing the bay's capacity to erase human presence almost immediately. Hidden channels and submerged rocks presented additional hazards, often concealed by snow or early ice, which searchers later recognized as common pitfalls in the bay. Even small skiffs could be diverted by these obstacles, and the ever-changing ice flows added further unpredictability. Investigators noted that prior expeditions had recorded similar navigation errors, leading to minor accidents or extended delays, demonstrating that the terrain itself was a primary agent of mystery. In the case of the lost party, these factors likely compounded the initial disorientation and contributed to the abrupt cessation of observable movement. Search efforts, coordinated from nearby ports and involving both local fishermen and government officials, expanded over the bay's complex channels, hampered by narrow passages and shifting ice flows. Boats combed every inlet, while volunteers on shore traced potential landing points and tracked ice drift. Harsh weather limited the range and effectiveness of these operations, forcing repeated retracing of areas already surveyed. Despite the dedication and expertise of all involved, no sign of the group was recovered beyond a few scattered and ambiguous objects, leaving the bay largely unchanged and the mystery intact. Footprints and broken oars found along certain edges of the bay hinted at a struggle or improvisation, yet beyond these faint signs, the group's trail vanished entirely into the mist. Investigators emphasized the difficulty of interpreting such sparse evidence. A single displaced object could signify an accident, an attempt to land, or simply the natural movement of ice and tide. Forensic detail confirmed that nothing suggested foul play beyond environmental interference, yet the disappearance remained total and inexplicable. Each clue led only to more questions, reinforcing the sense that the bay absorbed events without record. Experts reviewing the case noted that sudden tidal shifts, hidden currents, and the unpredictability of ice movement could account for the absence of further traces, but no single explanation satisfied the lingering questions. Historical records of Disenchantment Bay indicate that tides can rise dramatically, and currents may shift in minutes, sweeping objects or small boats out of sight. Glacial melt contributes to subtle but continuous changes in the landscape, further complicating efforts to track movement. Analysts concluded that while natural hazards could explain the party's vanishing, the complete lack of corroborating evidence amplified the sense of mystery. Years later, the lost party remained a cautionary tale for navigators of the bay, emblematic of the Alaskan Triangle's capacity to turn even routine travel into a lasting enigma. Locals spoke of the event with subdued awe, aware that the bay had claimed explorers before and would likely do so again. Maps were annotated, sailors shared oral warnings, and the area's hazards were studied carefully, yet the disappearance persisted as a case study in environmental unpredictability. Its resonance extended beyond maritime circles, becoming part of the larger mythology surrounding vanishings in the Alaskan Triangle. The currents carry their absence through icy channels and hidden inlets, leaving the bay itself as the only witness to the party's vanished passage. The unanswered distress call of Jim O'Neill. The radio crackled in the thin icy air over Alaska's mountainous expanse, carrying a signal that would soon vanish into silence. The peaks below rose jagged and dark, partially obscured by drifting clouds, while frozen valleys reflected the fleeting daylight in muted silver tones. Icebergs and scattered floes moved slowly along the fjord, producing a faint hollow resonance that echoed through the air. For those monitoring the frequency, the signal was brief but unmistakable, a call for help whose urgency was matched by its sudden disappearance. It would be the last confirmed contact with Jim O'Neill, a pilot whose journey into the Alaskan Triangle would end in unresolved mystery and lingering questions about the reliability of communication in this remote wilderness. Jim O'Neill, an experienced pilot familiar with the Alaskan terrain, had embarked on a routine flight that afternoon, confident in his training yet unprepared for the rapid escalation of circumstances. He held a commercial pilot certification with extensive experience navigating fjords and mountain valleys in winter conditions, including previous solo flights across the Alaskan interior. His preparation was meticulous. Weather reports reviewed, emergency checklists completed, and a fully functioning radio maintained according to recommended protocols. Even with such experience, O'Neill's disappearance would reveal how quickly technical precision could be challenged by the region's unforgiving combination of weather, topography, and isolation. As he ascended along the fjord, the peaks appeared jagged and unyielding, their shadows stretching across snow-laden valleys while patches of low clouds drifted unpredictably through the air. The terrain's complexity, with its sudden ridges, hidden crevasses, and ice-clad slopes, demanded constant attention. Sunlight glinted off frozen surfaces, creating illusions of depth and false horizons, while intermittent gusts buffeted the aircraft unexpectedly. Flight logs showed that visibility fluctuated dramatically, and the interplay of light, snow, and mist challenged even experienced pilots' perception. Every moment required vigilance, for a single misjudgment could carry severe consequences in a region where even minor errors might cascade into disaster. The distress call came suddenly, brief but clear, transmitted over a standard frequency and containing details of unexpected trouble, though its precise cause was never confirmed. Records indicate that O'Neill reported mechanical issues and a need to divert, yet the transmission cut off before he could provide exact coordinates. The clarity of the initial signal suggested it originated near areas accessible to ground observers, yet the mountains and atmospheric conditions rendered subsequent reception intermittent and unreliable. Logs retained the faint echo of his voice, carrying both urgency and the unsettling abruptness of disappearance. The call's brevity became a defining element of the mystery, leaving only fragmented logs as evidence of the pilot's final movements. Operators at nearby stations attempted immediate contact, repeating frequencies and triangulating signals, but mountainous interference and shifting weather rendered their efforts ineffective. Messages sent in reply often arrived too late or were never received, absorbed into the terrain and atmospheric anomalies. Observers documented that even skilled radio technicians struggled to maintain a reliable link in the fjords, where temperature inversions, reflecting peaks, and dense cloud cover could distort or erase transmissions. Each failed attempt heightened tension, as personnel realized that the familiar procedural safeguards might be insufficient against the region's formidable natural forces. Atmospheric conditions, combined with the region's magnetic anomalies and jagged terrain, contributed to the rapid dissipation of the signal, leaving only partial logs and faint echoes to mark its presence. Scientific studies of Alaska note that geomagnetic variations can interfere with shortwave frequencies, while sudden snow squalls and microbursts in high valleys produce unpredictable distortions. These environmental factors offer plausible explanations for the disappearance of the signal itself, yet they do little to explain the absence of any physical trace of O'Neill or his aircraft. Each failed attempt to locate him reinforced the sense of vulnerability in a region where human presence can vanish without a trace. Instrumentation in extreme cold proved unreliable, as documented in prior Alaskan flights, with altimeters and radios prone to temporary malfunctions and battery performance often degrading faster than expected. Pilots navigating the triangle routinely carried redundant systems, yet even the most thorough pre-flight checks could not anticipate sudden ice accumulation on antenna or unreported microbursts that might distort readings. Investigators later noted that such conditions, combined with the steep terrain and rapidly changing weather, could create critical delays in responding to a distress call or correcting course mid-flight. These technical vulnerabilities underscored how a single momentary failure could transform a routine flight into an enduring mystery. Search and rescue teams deployed quickly, scouring valleys, peaks, and frozen lakes, yet every flight and foot patrol returned with little more than the lingering sense of absence. Fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters combed hundreds of square miles, while ground teams navigated steep inclines and ice-covered riverbeds. Harsh weather limited visibility, forcing multiple reruns over previously surveyed areas. Even experienced searchers acknowledged the difficulty of operating in terrain where snow-covered crevasses could conceal a downed plane or human remains for months. Despite these efforts, no wreckage or personal items were recovered, leaving the case open and unresolved. Radar scans and sporadic eyewitness reports offered fragments of potential sightings, yet none provided conclusive evidence of O'Neill's location or condition. A fishing boat crew reported observing a small aircraft crossing a valley ridge around the same time as the distress call, though visibility was poor and their testimony could not be corroborated. Radar sweeps briefly detected a faint blip consistent with a single aircraft, but the signal vanished before tracking could be completed. Each potential clue dissolved into ambiguity, emphasizing how easily the region's geography can conceal even an experienced pilot from observation. Over time, the unanswered distress call became a reference point for pilots and navigators, a cautionary reminder of how swiftly technology and environment can conspire to obscure human presence. Aviation advisories now emphasize redundancy in communication, the use of multiple frequencies, and prearranged check-in protocols to reduce risk in isolated regions. O'Neill's case is cited as a seminal example in aviation safety discussions and contributes to the enduring mystique of the Alaskan Triangle, where disappearances persist despite advancements in technology and search techniques. His final call remains a haunting illustration of the limits of human control when faced with the region's unpredictable and unforgiving forces. The mountains hold the memory of his signal, a fleeting trace of human urgency swallowed by an expanse that records nothing but its own relentless patterns. The disappearance of Trevor O'Keefe. Trevor O'Keefe checked his compass and notes for the third time that morning, ensuring every waypoint and emergency protocol was recorded before he left the small outpost. The disappearance in the Alaska Triangle would later confound search teams, but at the time every decision he made seemed methodical and deliberate. He reviewed radio check-ins, cross-referenced topographic markers with his maps, and confirmed that all communication devices were fully operational. Every routine step, while seemingly mundane, underscored the seriousness with which he approached this remote and unpredictable environment. The choices he made in those opening moments, however careful, could not anticipate the series of events that would render him untraceable and leave a mystery that persists decades later. His preparation reflected both experience and caution, from redundant navigation tools to a carefully packed survival kit. Yet the wilderness beyond demanded respect that planning alone could not guarantee. O'Keefe had undertaken similar expeditions before, logging hundreds of miles across rivers, glaciers, and snow-packed trails, but the Alaskan Triangle presented conditions that even veterans described as capricious and unforgiving. He studied weather reports and avalanche advisories, yet the region's unpredictability could render even the most accurate forecast obsolete within hours. His familiarity with survival techniques, shelter construction, signaling methods, and first aid protocols offered some reassurance, but they could not account for every potential hazard the terrain might present. Each step he took required constant attention, monitoring subtle shifts in footing, equipment readings, and potential hazards, as even minor miscalculations could prove disastrous. He moved carefully along a narrow river corridor, checking bearings at every juncture and adjusting routes to avoid loose rock or ice. The rhythmic crunch of his boots over snow alternated with the sharp snap of twigs underfoot, sounds that seemed amplified in the solitude of the wilderness. While this attentiveness is a hallmark of experienced hikers, it also highlights the isolation and vulnerability inherent to such expeditions. One momentary distraction or a misjudged crossing could have irreversible consequences. By midday, signs of irregularity began to emerge, footprints that seemed to appear in one area and vanish in the next, gear slightly displaced without explanation, and a sudden silence that suggested something was amiss. Notes later compiled by search teams documented the subtle inconsistencies left behind, fragments that suggested movement but could not confirm the trajectory or direction. The seemingly ordinary terrain concealed these small irregularities, which might have been overlooked by even seasoned observers. Yet each anomaly contributed to the growing sense of unease surrounding O'Keefe's progress, and the realization that the wilderness could conceal far more than it revealed. The first indications that something had gone wrong came in reports from other hikers and locals, noting unusual tracks, abandoned equipment, or faint calls carried by the wind that could not be traced. These reports were sporadic and inconsistent, varying from faint impressions in snow to partially buried gear that offered no clear explanation. Investigators later noted that such findings were characteristic of the Triangle's disappearances, partial, tantalizing, and often contradictory. Nothing could confirm the fate of the missing hiker, and each fragment left more questions than answers. O'Keeffe's own journals, later recovered at the outpost, revealed meticulous notes on potential hazards, including sudden drop-offs along riverbeds, unstable snow bridges, and areas prone to hidden crevices. These entries indicated a precise awareness of the risks in the region, yet also highlighted how quickly conditions could change. A river crossing he had marked as safe one morning could become perilous hours later. Investigators noted that these detailed observations, while invaluable for understanding his planning, also underscored the randomness of the triangle's dangers. An experienced hiker could follow all known precautions and still encounter circumstances beyond control. This context added a layer of complexity to search efforts, emphasizing that the absence of O'Keeffe could be the result of a single unpredictable factor in an otherwise well-prepared expedition. Responders moved into action rapidly, coordinating by radio and helicopter, yet procedural challenges and unpredictable conditions quickly frustrated even the most systematic efforts to locate O'Keeffe. Dense forests, steep ridges, and sudden weather shifts limited visibility and accessibility, forcing repeated flights and treks over areas that had already been combed. Experienced teams described the frustration of retracing paths only to find that evidence could vanish overnight, hidden by snow, ice, or the subtle movements of wildlife. Every attempt at locating him highlighted the region's capacity to erase human presence almost entirely, leaving only fleeting traces for investigators to piece together. Occasional eyewitness accounts suggested fleeting glimpses of movement or objects inconsistent with natural terrain, but these were never confirmed, leaving investigators with only fragments of information. Some reports described a figure moving with unusual speed or appearing in locations that were difficult to reconcile with known travel routes. Others referenced equipment partially buried or placed in ways that did not correspond to any logical pattern. These accounts, though unverified, reinforced the mystery and the sense that O'Keeffe's disappearance did not follow predictable rules of space or time. The psychological strain of isolation and uncertainty, compounded by the region's disorienting layout and hazards, meant that every lead required scrutiny and left room for doubt. Searchers spoke of the challenges of interpreting footprints in snow that shifted constantly under changing temperatures, or of distinguishing natural phenomena from evidence of human passage. Even the most disciplined teams acknowledged that the wilderness could mislead perception, creating illusions of movement or presence where none existed. Each day spent without resolution intensified both concern and the enigmatic nature of the disappearance. Over the years, O'Keeffe's disappearance has become a reference in discussions of preparation, risk assessment, and the unpredictable nature of the Alaskan Triangle, illustrating the fine line between skill and chance. Training manuals, safety briefings, and local law alike have cited his case as a stark reminder that even experienced individuals, equipped with knowledge and foresight, remain vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of nature. The story is recounted not with sensationalism, but as an enduring example of the Alaskan Triangle's capacity to conceal, confound, and frustrate understanding. No trace remains definitive, only the calculated paths and cautious choices of a man who entered the unknown, leaving behind a puzzle that refuses to yield its answer. The unreturned glacier trek of Tammy Stokes. Questions about her route occupied Tammy Stokes as she consulted the glacier maps, weighing the known hazards against the unfamiliar terrain she planned to navigate. The Alaska Triangle, notorious for vanishing hikers and explorers, would soon claim her as another unsolved case. Every choice she considered, from the timing of her checkpoints to the order of her communication checks, was made with careful calculation. Though she had prepared meticulously, the vastness of the glacier and the unpredictability of its conditions introduced an element that no amount of planning could fully mitigate. Her awareness of this reality lent a quiet tension to her preparations, a reminder that the wilderness could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Her journal revealed careful analysis of potential crevasses, snow bridges, and shifting ice fields, demonstrating a methodical mind aware of the glacier's hidden threats. Stokes had recorded not only landmarks and checkpoints, but also contingencies for sudden weather shifts and possible injury scenarios. These notes, later recovered, provided a rare glimpse into her thought process and highlighted the depth of her preparation. Even her choice of gear reflected both experience and foresight. Layered clothing suited for extreme cold, navigational instruments calibrated multiple times, and emergency signaling devices intended to withstand environmental stress. Every communication check and equipment calibration reflected an attempt to anticipate the unpredictable, a silent acknowledgement that even the best-laid plans could falter. She transmitted her expected route and time markers to local authorities and colleagues, but there was no way to guarantee that these would provide any guidance once she entered the glacier's more remote zones. Radio signals would later show intermittent transmissions before ceasing entirely, offering a chilling indication of how rapidly conditions could shift and isolate a traveller. Each moment of preparation now seems poignant, emphasizing the stark contrast between her careful strategy and the sudden disappearance that followed. Early into the trek, she noticed inconsistencies in the mapped features, small anomalies that required adjustments to her route and heightened vigilance at every turn. Rocks and ice formations appeared subtly different from what the maps indicated, and crevasses she expected to be shallow proved to be deceptive. Stokes marked these observations in her notes, demonstrating awareness of the glacier's dynamic nature. Though she managed these early challenges with skill, they served as subtle reminders that even a seasoned trekker was at the mercy of the glacier's shifting, often imperceptible forces. Stokes had also carried a small notebook recording ice conditions, subtle variations in snow density, and the locations of meltwater channels that could quickly shift or collapse. These notes, later recovered, highlighted her acute awareness of the glacier's unpredictability and her attempt to anticipate natural hazards that could impede progress. Investigators noted that her observations aligned closely with known patterns of glacial movement, indicating that she was not merely following maps, but actively reading the environment in real time. The level of detail demonstrated a skill set beyond ordinary trekking knowledge, reinforcing the notion that her disappearance was not due to negligence, but rather the unpredictable forces inherent to the Alaska Triangle. Later assessments by search teams documented faint footprints, a partially opened pack, and intermittent radio signals that abruptly ceased, leaving only fragments of her presence. Investigators meticulously recorded each clue, mapping the limited trail that remained in a region notorious for erasing human traces. Some items recovered suggested a careful, deliberate progression along the glacier, while others raised questions about whether she had deviated from her intended path. Each fragment was a puzzle piece, offering insight yet deepening the mystery, reinforcing the sense that the glacier itself seemed to absorb evidence almost as quickly as it was left behind. The glacier's treacherous layout complicated search operations, where hidden crevasses and unstable ice made every mile a challenge for investigators attempting to reconstruct her path. Teams faced constant risk from sudden ice collapses, shifting snowfields, and extreme temperatures that could impair both equipment and judgment. Helicopters could survey only limited sections at a time, and ground teams often encountered barriers that required backtracking or extended exposure to hazardous conditions. Every attempt to locate her emphasized the difficulty of navigating an environment that could erase footprints, displace gear, and obscure signals within hours, leaving searchers to rely on intuition as much as evidence. Testimonies from those in the area suggested fleeting glimpses of movement in areas inconsistent with the expected route, but none could be conclusively linked to Stokes. Some reported a shadow crossing a ridge in the distance or an isolated piece of equipment, visible for only a brief moment. Others recalled radio signals that were unusual or garbled, their source never definitively identified. These accounts, while inconclusive, added to the enigmatic aura of the case, illustrating how a limited perspective in such a vast and dynamic landscape can challenge even the most diligent efforts to reconstruct events. Analysis of these reports, combined with weather data and recorded expedition notes, offered only partial insights into what might have occurred, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Experts debated potential scenarios, ranging from minor navigation miscalculations to the impact of sudden weather changes and the subtle destabilization of ice formations. Each theory was grounded in a factual understanding of glacier dynamics and human behavior under stress, but none could fully account for the disappearance. The combination of skill, experience, and foresight on Stokes's part contrasted sharply with the outcome, underscoring the Alaska Triangle's capacity to defy prediction. In time, her disappearance became emblematic within the mountaineering community, a stark reminder of the Alaskan Triangle's unpredictability and the limits of preparation. Safety seminars, mountaineering manuals, and local discussions referenced her case not as an anomaly but as a lesson in environmental respect, illustrating that even meticulous planning cannot eliminate uncertainty. Her story continued to resonate because it reflected a broader truth about human endeavour in extreme conditions. Skill and foresight increase survival odds but do not guarantee them, especially in regions as notoriously mysterious as the Alaska Triangle. The meticulous planning and careful observation she left behind are all that remain, silent witnesses to a journey that vanished into uncertainty. The missing survey team of Wrangell, St. Elias. The survey team convened early in the morning, reviewing maps, instruments, and the ambitious objectives that had drawn them into Wrangell, St. Elias. Their disappearance would soon become a perplexing addition to the mysteries of the Alaska Triangle. Every member had studied the region's extreme terrain, and each instrument was meticulously checked for accuracy, from theodolites to barometric altimeters. The team's plan involved detailed mapping of uncharted glacial valleys and crevasse-ridden slopes, aiming to expand knowledge of the mountain system's geological and topographical complexity. Even with precise planning, the vastness of Wrangell, St. Elias left room for unpredictable variables, weather shifts, unstable ice, and the sheer isolation of the region. Each member brought specialized expertise, from geological analysis to topographical surveying, creating a group capable of navigating one of North America's most formidable wilderness areas. Their backgrounds reflected a blend of field experience and scientific training. Some had years of work in glacial studies, while others were skilled in mountaineering and survival techniques essential for extreme environments. This combination of knowledge and experience gave the team confidence, yet their professionalism underscored an awareness that preparation could only reduce, not eliminate, the inherent risks of the Alaskan frontier. Departing from base camp, the team adhered to a rigorous schedule of measurements, recordings, and checkpoints designed to maximize both safety and data collection. Each day's plan involved mapping key landmarks, recording ice flow patterns, and monitoring changes in crevasse width and depth. Observations were cross-checked among team members to ensure consistency, and the team maintained a careful log of coordinates and environmental conditions. While such discipline would later become central to investigations, at the time it reinforced a sense of order in a landscape that could otherwise overwhelm even the most experienced surveyors. By the second day, minor discrepancies in elevation readings and trail markers began to emerge, prompting adjustments and careful note-taking that would later prove essential to reconstructing their route. Ice formations appeared in unexpected locations, and snow accumulation altered the visibility of previously identified paths. The team meticulously documented each anomaly, aware that these subtle variations could signal hazards or affect the accuracy of their mapping. Each adjustment was executed with deliberate care, reflecting the delicate balance between human observation and the glacier's ever-changing reality. Their instruments occasionally picked up signals of unknown origin, while environmental conditions began to intensify, creating subtle yet compounding difficulties for even the most experienced members. Radio interference increased as storm clouds gathered, and sudden drops in temperature stressed both personnel and equipment. The interplay between natural phenomena and technological limitations illustrated the precarious position of explorers operating in one of the planet's least forgiving environments. Observers later suggested that these disturbances may have coincided with the final hours during which the team could have been located. Known crevasses and unstable ice ridges had been meticulously charted by the survey team, noting each with the precision of cartographers aware that one misstep could prove fatal. They relied on avalanche forecasts and glaciological studies to anticipate potential hazards, adjusting their path daily based on snowpack conditions and subtle shifts in the ice. Some notes indicated areas where the glacier's surface showed recent movement or thin snow bridges, highlighting dangers that might not be immediately visible. These meticulous observations reflected both their skill and the ever-present reality that, even with experience and foresight, the Wrangell St. Elias's wilderness could challenge the limits of human endurance. The last confirmed radio transmission indicated routine updates on their position, yet subsequent attempts to reach them yielded only static, raising concern among coordinators and colleagues. Messages that once flowed predictably became irregular, and the tone suggested no immediate threat, yet the sudden silence that followed left a growing unease. Those monitoring the transmissions were struck by how quickly the familiar rhythm of communication ended, replaced by unanswered calls and the faint, inexplicable noises that often precede a disappearance in remote terrain. Ground teams and aerial observers were dispatched swiftly, but steep mountains, crevassed glaciers, and unpredictable weather severely limited search coverage and visibility. Helicopters could only hover briefly over valleys, and snowdrifts concealed trails that might have provided vital clues. On the ground, searchers contended with ice bridges that could collapse without warning, shifting snowfields that masked footprints, and sub-zero temperatures that tested endurance. Every hour spent searching underscored the difficulty of locating individuals in a region designed by nature to remain impervious to human observation. Reports of fleeting signals or unexplained movements in isolated valleys added to the mystery, though none could be definitively linked to the missing surveyors. Pilots reported shadows or fleeting figures crossing ridgelines, while ground observers noted disturbances in snow patterns that might have been made by humans or by shifting ice. Investigators faced the challenge of separating observation from conjecture, aware that even well-trained eyes could misinterpret subtle movements in a dynamic environment. These inconclusive reports only amplified the enigma surrounding the team's disappearance, leaving the investigation suspended between fact and speculation. Experts later analysed terrain patterns, snow accumulation, and documented hazards along the projected route, weighing environmental factors against the team's known capabilities. Glacier surveys indicated areas where ice could collapse without warning, while wind speeds and avalanche risk were cross-referenced with the team's planned schedule. Analysts concluded that even experienced surveyors could encounter conditions that negated prior preparation, emphasizing the Alaskan wilderness's capacity to overwhelm human skill. Yet despite these findings, no definitive sequence of events could account for the sudden vanishing, leaving the puzzle unresolved. Over time, the case became a cautionary benchmark for surveying expeditions, a stark reminder of the unforeseen challenges embedded within Rangel Saints. Elias and the broader Alaska Triangle, universities, geological institutes, and field training programs referenced the disappearance, framing it as a lesson in risk assessment, preparedness, and the limits of human foresight. The story persisted as both a memorial to those lost and a tangible example of how the wilderness resists complete understanding, no matter how disciplined the effort. Within the isolated wilderness, no definitive trace of the team emerged, leaving only questions, fragmented evidence, and the enduring enigma of a mission that vanished into the wilderness. The lost charter of the Fairbanks 5. The charter flight from Fairbanks had been meticulously scheduled, with 5 passengers and a single pilot preparing for a routine journey that would soon vanish into the Alaska Triangle. Their plans followed a standard itinerary, yet the vastness of Alaska's interior and the region's notorious reputation for sudden weather shifts would soon transform a simple flight into a baffling disappearance. Documentation indicated careful pre-flight inspections and route planning, highlighting the precautions taken by those familiar with the region's inherent dangers. Even with experience and thorough preparation, the Alaska Triangle held an unpredictability that would challenge every assumption about a safe journey. Each passenger had personal or professional reasons for the trip, and collectively they represented a cross-section of local expertise and familiarity with the Alaskan environment. Some were frequent travelers accustomed to small aircraft navigation, while others had personal or business engagements that required reaching remote locations. Their experience lent confidence to the expedition, yet it also emphasized how disappearance could strike even the most capable individuals when circumstances conspired beyond human control. The blend of seasoned judgment and the routine nature of the flight amplified the mystery when communication ceased, leaving loved ones and authorities to speculate about the unknown. The aircraft, a small twin-engine plane equipped for regional flights, was cleared for departure after a thorough inspection of its engines, fuel systems, and navigation instruments. Pilots had confirmed weight limits, reviewed fuel loads, and examined mechanical logs to ensure the plane could complete its journey safely. Every system was checked and double-checked, demonstrating the diligent standard to aviation in the region. Despite these measures, history had shown that no amount of preparation could fully account for the sudden variables introduced by the Alaska Triangle's volatile conditions. Every procedural precaution was still vulnerable to nature's sudden interventions, from invisible wind shear to unexpected cloud layers that could appear in minutes. As the plane lifted from the Fairbanks runway, ground personnel noted weather conditions that were ordinary for the region, yet carried the potential for sudden shifts at higher altitudes. Cloud formations suggested the possibility of localized turbulence, while reports indicated occasional wind shear in adjacent valleys. None of these conditions appeared unusual on departure, yet they provided the first hints of the environmental challenges the flight would encounter, reminding observers that even routine flights in Alaska required a vigilant awareness of the unexpected. Small deviations from a flight path, even a few degrees off course, could have consequences magnified across hundreds of miles of isolated terrain. Early radio transmissions recorded routine positional updates, but intermittent static hinted at minor interference that would later raise questions about the plane's route and status. The pilot reported expected waypoints and altitudes, yet some transmissions were fragmented or incomplete, leaving air traffic controllers with an uneasy sense that communication might soon fail entirely. These minor anomalies, though inconclusive at the time, would later become central to reconstructing the timeline and understanding how the aircraft disappeared without warning. Each signal, however brief, became a critical piece in a puzzle that would never be solved. Through the thick forests and shifting clouds, search and rescue teams were mobilized quickly, but mountainous terrain, unpredictable clouds, and dense forests obstructed even the most advanced aerial reconnaissance. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft scoured ridgelines, valleys, and glacial slopes for signs of wreckage. Ground teams faced challenges that included narrow passes, snowdrifts, and unstable surfaces that could conceal even larger objects. Hours stretched into days with no definitive leads, underscoring how quickly a well-planned response could be hindered by Alaska's unforgiving landscape. The absence of physical evidence turned every passing hour into a growing uncertainty about the aircraft's fate. Witnesses reported vague sightings of an aircraft at unusual angles or altitudes, though none could be conclusively linked to the missing charter. Some observers described hearing engines in regions where no flight plan should have allowed passage, while others noted a small silhouette briefly crossing a horizon obscured by fog or low clouds. Investigators later reviewed these reports, but could not establish certainty, leaving each anecdote suspended between potential reality and human error. The lack of verifiable evidence reinforced the unsettling nature of the disappearance and compounded the anxiety of the search effort. Aviation specialists analysed flight paths, instrument readings, and weather reports, noting the hazards inherent to Alaska's volatile airspace and the narrow margin for error in small aircraft navigation. Simulations and historical comparisons highlighted the risk of rapidly changing conditions, particularly when flying above mountain ranges where microclimates could produce sudden fog banks, downdrafts, or icing. Analysts also considered mechanical failure, navigational miscalculations, and human factors, concluding that the combination of any single element could have been sufficient to prevent recovery of the aircraft. Even minor deviations could place the plane in areas impossible to reach or detect without a stroke of luck. Following exhaustive searches, no wreckage or definitive clues were recovered, leaving investigators to piece together a timeline that ended abruptly in uncertainty. Logbooks, maintenance records, and flight plans provided context, but failed to illuminate the aircraft's final position or the passenger's fate. Over time, speculation grew and theories circulated, yet none satisfied the strict criteria of verifiable evidence, leaving the mystery unresolved and emphasizing the Alaska Triangle's capacity to confound even the most methodical inquiries. Every unanswered question became a reminder of how quickly the known could vanish into the unknown. The disappearance of the Fairbanks 5 became a somber reference point in regional aviation, a reminder of how quickly routine flights can encounter the unforeseen challenges of the Alaska Triangle. The case influenced safety protocols, emergency communication standards, and the planning of small charter flights in remote regions, serving as a cautionary tale for pilots and passengers alike. Local communities remembered the vanished flight as both a tragedy and a perplexing puzzle, emblematic of a wilderness where human intentions often meet impassable forces. Each year, anniversaries of the disappearance sparked renewed interest in the case, as well as reflection on the limits of human preparation in the face of vast natural forces. In the remote reaches of Alaska, no trace of the aircraft or its passengers was ever found, leaving the fate of the Fairbanks 5 suspended between speculation, theory, and an enduring Alaskan enigma. The vanishing of Timothy Barnes. Bitter gusts swept across the jagged ridges of the Alaska Triangle, stirring snowdrifts into patterns that seemed to shift with a mind of their own before Barnes's presence was even known to the world below. These swirling formations, fragile and ever-changing, marked both the paths already travelled and the hazards that lay hidden, transforming familiar trails into deceptive mazes of ice and stone. In a region where the weather could shift from calm to lethal within minutes, even routine crossings carried a latent threat, leaving no margin for error. It was into this environment that Timothy Barnes would venture, a man prepared yet ultimately unprepared for the unseen forces waiting beyond the tree line. The small cabin near the river's edge, long abandoned by previous explorers, held traces of human activity that hinted at the routes most travelled and those best avoided. Footprints worn into the packed snow, supplies cached in nearby shelters, and the faint remnants of campfires suggested a continuity of passage and survival strategies, yet they also underscored the unpredictability of a land that refused to yield itself fully to human understanding. These markers offered clues for those who dared the Triangle's expanse, but they were no guarantee against the sudden disappearance of an experienced individual like Barnes. Satellite imagery and topographical maps revealed hidden crevasses and treacherous passes, painting a landscape that could easily confound even the most experienced adventurers. The steep inclines and deep valleys created microclimates capable of producing sudden fog, sharp wind gusts, or cascading snow, each capable of obscuring tracks or disorienting a traveller in an instant. Analysts reviewing Barnes's planned route later noted several particularly dangerous stretches, where a misstep could have catastrophic consequences, yet at the time these warnings were unseen and unknowable to him, as they often are for anyone entering this remote wilderness. Local search authorities had already documented prior incidents in the region, noting how sudden fogs and microclimates often swallowed travellers with little warning. Records of lost hikers, stranded pilots, and vanished survey teams reinforced the Alaska Triangle's reputation as a domain where preparation met its limits. The cumulative knowledge of these past events shaped every search operation that followed Barnes's disappearance, yet even with historical patterns in mind, no standard response could guarantee recovery, and the area's history only deepened the sense of foreboding. When radio chatter first registered, it was fragmented and distorted, offering only fleeting glimpses of movement across the desolate expanse. Intermittent signals suggested Barnes had reached portions of his planned route, yet there was no consistent location or identifiable pattern. Each transmission left investigators with more questions than answers. Was he attempting to navigate a safer path, signalling distress, or inadvertently moving into more dangerous terrain? The fragmented communications became the first signs that the expedition's trajectory had shifted into uncertainty. Aerial reconnaissance teams navigated winding valleys and sheer cliffs, scanning for traces of passage, clothing, or tracks that might hint at a route taken. Helicopters hovered above the tree line, cameras trained on snowfields and ridgelines, where footprints or movement could be discerned. Observers reported faint impressions in the snow, small disturbances that could have been animals, previous travellers, or Barnes himself. Despite hours of coverage, the vast terrain offered nearly limitless hiding places, turning every potential lead into another layer of mystery. Close inspection of aerial photographs revealed faint anomalies in the snowpack that suggested recent movement, possibly made by a person or animal, yet none could be definitively attributed to Barnes. Investigators scrutinized these subtle depressions, tracing potential paths across frozen ridges and hidden gullies, but shifting winds and drifting snow soon erased any evidence. Even with drones and satellite imaging, the region's volatile conditions transformed every lead into uncertainty, leaving search teams to weigh each fragmentary sign against the vastness of the wilderness. These fleeting traces deepened the mystery, illustrating how the Alaska Triangle could swallow not only travellers, but also the records of their passage, preserving only questions and speculation. Those nearby reported distant sounds and shadows, yet none could definitively be connected to the missing individual, leaving every observation suspended in uncertainty. One hiker claimed to see a figure climbing a ridge at dusk, another noted a brief glimpse of a bright jacket near a frozen stream, while a pilot described engine-like echoes over the mountains despite no known aircraft in the area. Each account fueled speculation but provided no certainty, reinforcing the Alaska Triangle's capacity to absorb evidence into its sprawling isolation. Survival specialists later analysed terrain, weather conditions, and known routes, emphasising how even meticulous preparation could succumb to the region's hidden hazards. They noted that exposure, hypothermia, and rapid weather shifts could incapacitate even a skilled outdoorsman in minutes, and that one miscalculated step could send a traveller sliding into an unrecoverable area. The combination of Barnes's chosen route, the region's topography, and the conditions at the time illustrated just how tenuous human control can be when set against the vast mercurial wilderness. Weeks after the disappearance, the forested slopes and frozen riverbeds offered no clues, only the eerie silence of a land indifferent to human presence. Search parties found abandoned campsites and scattered personal items, yet none could be directly tied to Barnes. Each fruitless expedition reinforced the sense that the Triangle absorbed the missing into its larger rhythm, leaving nothing but speculation behind. The wilderness, in its stark and imposing isolation, seemed to both conceal and erase, leaving those searching with a growing impression that some disappearances were meant to remain permanent enigmas. The missing person's belongings, found in scattered locations along seemingly improbable paths, hinted at movement that challenged conventional explanations and left investigators grasping for answers. Items appeared in locations that did not align with planned routes, suggesting deviation, unplanned detours, or perhaps environmental forces that displaced them. Each discovery intensified questions about the final hours of Barnes's journey, but rather than clarifying events, the scattered artifacts emphasized the region's capacity to conceal its secrets. Investigators could only speculate about the forces that led a prepared individual to vanish without a trace. The Alaska Triangle retained its secrets, withholding the fate of Timothy Barnes in a way that defied logic, reason, and expectation. The missing hunters of Mystery Hills. The hunters had followed a routine trail through Mystery Hills, carrying familiar packs and rifles, unaware that the region's shifting microclimates could transform ordinary routes into perilous corridors in a matter of minutes. Their plan had seemed straightforward, a 3-day expedition to pursue moose and survey the highland ridges. Yet the Alaska Triangle had a reputation for swallowing travellers into its folds with an almost indifferent precision, and by the evening of their second day, the first hints of irregularity began to emerge. The dense spruce forests and jagged outcroppings, which appeared manageable under morning sunlight, had become labyrinthine, and the wind carried an eerie quiet that seemed to consume every ordinary sound of their passage. They had chosen a path intersecting with several steep gullies and dense spruce thickets, areas known to challenge even experienced trackers and complicate any potential search. Local maps highlighted the elevation shifts and hidden ravines, yet the hunters' confidence in their knowledge of the terrain seemed sufficient at the outset. Observers later noted that Mystery Hills, while often appearing familiar to locals, possessed a disorienting complexity. Small landmarks shifted with perspective, and minor streams could obscure passages or reroute unwary footsteps. The hunters' intended route took them through a valley, reputed for its sudden fog formation, and even the most prepared individuals could underestimate how quickly visibility could diminish. By midday, subtle irregularities appeared, a tent flap left slightly open, footprints abruptly ending, and scattered provisions suggesting the hunters' movements had been unexpectedly interrupted. Investigators piecing together the scene from nearby camps found no evidence of a struggle, yet the placement of supplies implied a sudden halt in progress. The scattered remnants offered only fragments of narrative: a boot placed at an odd angle, a hunting knife atop a flattened snowbank, a backpack partially buried by wind-driven snow. Each clue prompted more questions than answers, underscoring the unnerving efficiency with which the landscape could erase routine human activity. Local authorities, notified of the hunters' failure to return, mobilized ground teams familiar with the region, coordinating radios and search dogs. Though communication black spots in the valleys slowed their progress, searchers confronted steep inclines, narrow gullies, and treacherous snowfields that slowed even experienced teams. Aerial support struggled as well. Cloud cover often forced helicopters to land or retreat, leaving teams dependent on limited visibility and local intuition. The combination of terrain and technology limitations compounded the mystery, transforming a straightforward search into an uncertain and exhaustive pursuit of shadows and fleeting evidence. From cabins scattered across the hills, witnesses recalled distant shouts that faded before anyone could respond, as if sound itself was absorbed into the hills, leaving no clear indication of direction or origin. Residents described the unusual echo patterns and how familiar valley noises seemed warped or muffled, creating a sensation that the area itself rejected intrusion. While the reports could not be verified, they added a layer of unease to the search, suggesting that even human perception could be confounded by the triangle's geography. These fleeting impressions highlighted the complex interplay of human expectation and natural unpredictability in a region where ordinary signals could vanish without a trace. Helicopters circled the rugged slopes, scanning with infrared and high-resolution cameras, yet the dense vegetation and uneven terrain rendered most potential signs indistinct or misleading. Investigators recorded occasional heat signatures and glimmers in snowdrifts, but each promising lead dissolved under closer scrutiny. The search equipment, while sophisticated, could not compensate for the topography's intricacy. Sheer cliffs, hidden gullies, and thick tree cover consistently obscured movement patterns. As one pilot later remarked, "You can fly the same route 10 times and see something different each time, yet it may be nothing at all." During the search, investigators noted disturbed brush, fractured branches, and depressions in snow-covered clearings, all hinting at movement yet refusing to confirm the hunter's precise location or fate. These observations suggested that the hunters had traversed difficult terrain, but no continuous path could be traced reliably. Even the most experienced trackers could only hypothesize where the group might have gone, constrained by the terrain's deceptive scale and sudden microclimatic shifts. Each fragment of evidence teased a story that remained incomplete, a series of half-truths that illustrated the wilderness's capacity to obscure human presence. Hidden sinkholes and unstable ridges left subtle clues in the snow and soil, small scuff marks, broken twigs, and displaced stones, suggesting the hunters had altered their path in response to the treacherous terrain. Tracks abruptly shifted direction or vanished entirely at certain depressions, hinting at cautious detours or sudden missteps. Observers noted that the marks were inconsistent with normal hunting movements, implying that the hunters were contending with unforeseen obstacles rather than following a planned route. Each trace, ephemeral and fragmented, painted a fleeting portrait of human decisions made under duress, yet the wilderness seemed to absorb their presence almost immediately, leaving only fragments of what had occurred. Reconstruction of their intended path revealed decisions influenced by weather patterns and wildlife tracks, highlighting both the hunter's knowledge and the unpredictable forces at work in the triangle. The choice to follow elk prints, the need to navigate around snow-laden cliffs, and the temptation to cross seemingly stable ridges all presented opportunities for miscalculation. Seasonal variations in snowpack and sudden gusts could create hazards that were invisible on maps and nearly undetectable on the ground. Even meticulous planning, which included emergency protocols and GPS devices, could not entirely mitigate the region's inherent unpredictability. As days passed, abandoned gear and faint traces offered clues that could not be definitively interpreted, underscoring the persistent uncertainty surrounding the disappearance. Jackets, partially covered by snow, and hunting rifles left leaning against trees painted an incomplete portrait of events. Each discovery spurred renewed searches, yet none led to a conclusive outcome. Investigators documented these fragments carefully, aware that the smallest detail might hold significance, but time and environmental change rendered each clue increasingly ephemeral. Even the searchers' most thorough examinations yielded only fleeting impressions of what might have been, emphasizing the wilderness's capacity to erase its human visitors from memory. The pattern was familiar to those who had studied disappearances across the Alaska Triangle. Landscapes that seemed ordinary one moment could, without warning, absorb a person or group entirely, leaving only scattered hints for investigators to interpret. The limits of perception, the speed of environmental change, and the region's sheer scale combined to produce a persistent and unsettling ambiguity, reinforcing the sense that Mystery Hills retained its secrets well beyond human reach. The Mystery Hills held their silence, leaving the hunter's fate unresolved and the vast expanse to guard its secrets against all who dared enter. The unsettling exit of Daniel Marsden. A thin veil of low-hanging clouds concealed the ridges and valleys of the Alaska Triangle, casting a grey pall over the forests and rivers that cradled untold histories of disappearance. The season had shifted abruptly from early autumn warmth to bitter cold, leaving trails slick with frost and rivers partially choked with forming ice. Daniel Marsden had intended a brief exploration of one of the lesser-travelled corridors within the Triangle, a region known for its steep inclines and unpredictable weather. He departed with careful planning and a map that traced paths only lightly marked by previous travellers, unaware that the very environment around him seemed to conspire with uncertainty, making each step through the wilderness increasingly precarious. Navigation charts and supply manifests indicated careful preparation, yet even the most meticulous plans could not account for sudden snow squalls or treacherous ice that would challenge any traveller. Marsden's equipment, including a radio transmitter and survival pack, suggested he was ready for both long days and unforeseen overnight stays. The equipment, however, could not mitigate the disorienting effects of rapidly shifting fog or the sudden closure of mountain passes. Reports from local rangers emphasised that, in this sector, a 5-minute lapse in attention could turn familiar ground into a perilous maze, and even experienced adventurers sometimes vanished without a trace. Satellite weather data from the day of Marsden's departure revealed abrupt shifts in wind patterns and temperature gradients that could have disoriented even the most experienced navigators. These meteorological anomalies created pockets of dense fog and sudden snow squalls that were not visible in standard forecasts, potentially diverting him from intended routes or masking familiar landmarks. Analysts noted that such microclimates are common in the Alaska Triangle, forming rapidly in valleys and near river mouths, and they have historically contributed to several disappearances. The combination of wind shear and visibility loss would have made radio signals intermittent, explaining the failure of check-ins and the subsequent delayed response from rescue teams. Even advanced search technology, including aerial thermal scans, can be compromised under these conditions, leaving investigators to contend with both human absence and the environment's deceptive complexity. A missed radio check from Marsden's scheduled time set off the first ripple of concern, as authorities noted an unusual silence in the corridors of the normally reliable communications network. The scheduled report had been routine, a brief check-in confirming position and status, but the message never arrived. Calls made to his base camp went unanswered, and attempts to trace the last known signal produced nothing more than intermittent static. In a region where sparse coverage often frustrated communication, the absence of contact alone was enough to trigger immediate concern, suggesting that something beyond ordinary circumstances had intervened. Into the remote valleys and along jagged ridges, search parties mobilized with methodical precision, scouring ridgelines and river valleys, yet the expanse of wilderness and shifting weather patterns made each hour a battle against uncertainty. Teams of volunteers and professionals combed the area with dogs, GPS equipment, and snowmobiles, while aircraft conducted aerial sweeps to detect movement or heat signatures. Despite the thoroughness of these efforts, each sweep returned largely empty-handed. The terrain itself seemed to resist discovery. Deep ravines swallowed footsteps, dense forests obscured line of sight, and sudden patches of snow hid even the clearest tracks. Frost-laden trees bent under the weight of its accumulated ice, while hidden crevasses and rapidly forming snowdrifts reshaped familiar terrain into a labyrinth that challenged even local guides. Marsden's intended route followed a series of narrow ridges connecting isolated valleys, but persistent winds and early snowfall concealed markers and natural landmarks. Rangers noted that a single misstep could place a traveller hours from safety, and the combination of wind-blown snow and low visibility could erase the faintest trace of passage. In this way, the landscape itself became both barrier and veil, concealing Marsden in a theatre of uncertainty. Scattered gear discovered along a narrow trail suggested hurried movement, footprints abruptly fading into deep snow, leaving investigators with clues that were tantalizing but incomplete. A backpack, partially covered by fresh snowfall, contained a map marked with several tentative waypoints, along with a water bottle and personal items, seemingly abandoned in haste. Yet there were no signs of struggle, and no other objects indicated the direction Marsden might have taken. Each fragment of evidence offered tantalizing hints, yet none provided answers, leaving the searchers with the unnerving sense of a presence that had vanished without leaving a narrative behind. Residents of a nearby settlement reported seeing a solitary figure moving cautiously through the tree line, though details varied and left more questions than answers about Marsden's final movements. One local hunter described a man in a bright jacket navigating the ridges with apparent purpose, while another recalled hearing faint calls echoing across a valley before fading into silence. These accounts were separated by hours and miles, and none could be verified conclusively. They only served to intensify the mystery, presenting fragments of human activity without a coherent endpoint or explanation. Aerial reconnaissance using thermal imaging revealed no trace beyond the partial evidence found on the ground, underscoring the Alaska Triangle's ability to obscure even the most persistent search efforts. Multiple flyovers at varying altitudes failed to detect heat signatures, suggesting that Marsden had either moved beyond the scanned sectors or that the signals had been obscured by the cold and terrain. The technology, while advanced, was powerless against the unpredictable shifts of snow, wind and shadow that defined this corner of Alaska, leaving the searchers reliant on hope and painstaking ground investigation. Patterns of past disappearances in the region lent an unsettling resonance to the case, with Marsden's trajectory echoing routes that had long confounded authorities and explorers alike. Over decades, hikers, hunters and pilots had vanished along ridges and valleys with similar geographic profiles. Analysts noted that, in many cases, the lack of consistent evidence created more questions than answers, reinforcing the perception that the Triangle was a zone where natural hazards, human miscalculation, and unexplained phenomena converged to erase presence. As days stretched into weeks, each new hypothesis remained unconfirmed, and the ambiguity of Marsden's vanishing reinforced the notion that the Triangle itself seemed to bend the limits of human understanding. Searchers adjusted strategies, extended patrols, and combed newly exposed terrain as the seasonal thaw slowly altered the landscape. Yet, with each passing day, the certainty of finding him diminished. The wilderness, indifferent and vast, absorbed traces of passage, leaving the story suspended between hope and incomprehensible absence. In the silent vastness of the wilderness, Daniel Marsden's trail dissolves into an unresolved enigma, leaving the land to retain its quiet, impenetrable secrets. The lost research boat on Lake Iliamna. Lake Iliamna stretches across southwestern Alaska with a deceptive calm that belies the sudden storms and treacherous currents that have ensnared travelers for decades. The lake's vast expanse, nearly 50 miles long and over 20 miles wide at its broadest points, has long inspired both scientific study and wary respect from locals. On the day of the disappearance, a research boat carrying a small crew set out to complete routine environmental surveys, tracking water temperature fluctuations and sediment flows, yet the lake's unpredictability would soon render their careful preparations insufficient. By late morning, they were beyond the reach of immediate visual contact, their vessel cutting through waters known for sudden squalls and hidden eddies that can easily challenge even experienced navigators. The research boat carried a small crew tasked with environmental monitoring, their instruments designed to chart water temperature, oxygen levels, and sediment density with precision. Each member had extensive experience in Alaskan waters, familiar with the lake's shifting patterns and seasonal anomalies. The vessel was equipped with communication radios, sonar devices, and emergency beacons, all functioning as intended when it departed from the launch site at the village dock. Even with this preparation, Lake Iliamna's expansive surface offered little in the way of immediate rescue should anything go wrong, and the water's frigid temperatures left minimal margin for error. On the morning of their departure, routine preparations masked the subtle tension brought by wind gusts sweeping across the lake's surface. Clouds had gathered in the distance, their movements swift and unpredictable, producing sudden shifts in visibility and temperature. Equipment was double-checked, fuel tanks filled, and life jackets verified, all according to standard protocols. Yet the crew's cautious planning could not account for the lake's own force, a combination of depth, volume, and topography that makes precise navigation inherently challenging. Reports indicate that the vessel communicated briefly via radio, noting minor navigational adjustments, before contact abruptly ceased without explanation. The last transmission, seemingly routine, mentioned slight interference from the wind but offered no hint of immediate danger. Minutes passed before any response, and when attempts to re-establish contact failed, concern escalated. The abrupt silence was particularly alarming given the crew's experience and the vessel's reliable communication equipment. Investigators would later note that radio logs showed no emergency call preceding the disappearance, deepening the enigma surrounding the boat's fate. Authorities mobilized swiftly, dispatching search teams that combed the lake from shorelines, air and water, yet progress was slowed by unpredictable weather and limited visibility. Helicopters scanned the open expanse, while small boats traced potential routes based on the vessel's planned survey path. Local pilots reported fog banks moving in from the surrounding hills, reducing aerial effectiveness, while waves generated by sudden gusts hampered smaller craft. Despite a coordinated effort involving multiple agencies, the search yielded no immediate signs of the missing crew or their boat. Underwater surveys revealed sections of the lake where currents converge unexpectedly, creating whirlpools and turbulent eddies capable of overwhelming small boats. Sonar sweeps detected some debris, but no intact hull was located, and no trace of human presence was discovered below the surface. Experts explained that Lake Iliamna's unique geography, with submerged ridges and varying depths exceeding 600 feet, can easily conceal objects from both sonar and visual detection. The lake's extreme temperature further complicates rescue or recovery, as hypothermia can set in within minutes in open water, reducing chances of survival. Careful review of aerial and satellite imagery following the disappearance revealed unusual surface patterns on the lake, including streaks of foam and subtle ripples inconsistent with prevailing winds, suggesting that strong subsurface currents or shifting thermal layers may have influenced the boat's final trajectory. Local researchers noted that Lake Iliamna is home to a network of submerged springs, some of which release colder water that can create localized turbulence and unexpected drag on vessels. Such natural phenomena, combined with the already volatile weather conditions that day, might have contributed to the dispersal of debris and complicated the search, offering a glimpse into the lake's hidden dynamics that are often invisible to those above the surface. Amid the drifting debris, investigators documented isolated items floating far from the anticipated course, including a life jacket and a partially secured instrument crate, yet the crew remained unaccounted for. These artifacts, though tangible, offered few clues regarding the sequence of events that led to the disappearance. Analysis suggested that the items had drifted with surface currents for several miles, but without additional context, no conclusions could be drawn. The scattered debris underscored the lake's power to displace objects unpredictably, emphasizing the challenge of reconstructing the final moments of the research team. Historically, Lake Iliamna has claimed vessels under mysterious circumstances, from commercial boats to small recreational craft, each disappearance leaving unanswered questions. Folklore and anecdotal accounts from fishermen and pilots describe sudden storms, phantom waves, and navigational anomalies that seem unique to the lake. While these stories are often speculative, official records confirm multiple incidents of boats vanishing or being found in altered positions after brief periods, supporting the notion that the lake is both vast and capricious. Official assessments suggest a combination of sudden storms, equipment limitations, and the lake's unpredictable geography, though none can fully explain the absence of the crew. Rescue reports emphasize that even experienced personnel are vulnerable in Lake Iliamna's waters, where strong winds can form and dissipate in moments, and submerged topography can create currents that appear inexplicable to observers on the surface. The vessel's intended path followed a previously charted survey route, yet this familiarity offered no safeguard against the lake's natural hazards. Even after extensive searches, the water yields no further evidence, and the lake's surface conceals depths that may forever guard its secrets. Maps, sonar data, and witness reports collectively document the effort, yet none can account for the missing research boat or the crew aboard. The case remains open, the lake's enigmatic nature continuing to challenge investigators and historians alike. Each day that passes deepens the sense of isolation and uncertainty, leaving the disappearance shrouded in both fact and mystery. The research boat's route, once meticulously plotted, now lingers only in reports and memories, leaving the lake to hold the fate of those who ventured into its uncharted expanse. The disappearance of Richard Hills. On a frigid February afternoon in 2004, Richard Hills left his home in Soldotna, a modest town on the Kenai Peninsula, intending only to drive north to Anchorage for a paycheck, a simple errand that would become one of Alaska's enduring mysteries. He climbed into his red Dodge truck and departed into snow-blanketed roads, leaving behind the family who counted on him and stepping into a world of white silence where tracks vanish as though swallowed by drifting snow. Snow had already settled thick on the ground, lending the roads a deceptive quietness that muffled engines and footsteps alike, turning even a routine drive into a fragile thread between warmth and oblivion. Hills drove steadily, familiar with the highways and small towns scattered along the peninsula, yet the landscape around him seemed to close in under the pale winter light, the mountains distant and silent, the spruce and birch swaying under a grey sky that promised little mercy. He reached Anchorage, completed his errand, and returned north, never imagining that each mile would pull him deeper into a mystery that would baffle searchers for years. Days later, his truck was discovered outside the small settlement of Sterling, ploughed deep into a snowbank as if abandoned in haste. Inside the cab lay the keys in the ignition, a wallet untouched, and nearly $300 in cash on the front seat. It was a scene of complete normalcy and quiet panic at once, as if someone had simply evaporated from existence. Residents marvelled that nothing in the truck appeared out of place. Nothing suggested struggle or foul play, only the stark emptiness of a man gone without a trace. What followed defied explanation. Hill's footprints trailed from the truck into the nearby forest, dragging slightly as if one leg bore a weight or was injured, then emerged on a back porch of an isolated house. From there, the tracks continued onto the skeleton of an abandoned airstrip and abruptly ended. Dense spruce and birch, thick with snow, swallowed the trail completely. Search dogs, once so adept at following a scent, lost all trace in the woods. It was as though the land itself had claimed him. Local volunteers, family members, and veteran search and rescue workers combed the surrounding woods and lowlands, guided by the faint hope of recovery and memories of previous near-miraculous rescues in the Alaskan wilderness. They knew how the terrain could play tricks on the senses, a thin crust of snow hiding a jagged drop, a shallow creek carrying footprints away, the wind covering tracks within minutes. Weeks became months, months became years, and still nothing surfaced. No body, no clothing, no discarded item of any kind. The silence of the forest spoke more loudly than any discovery could have. Hills was not new to this land. He understood its moods and dangers, sudden blizzards, ice streams that swallowed footprints, and icy ground that could conceal a misstep with fatal results. He had lived his life outdoors as a labourer, accustomed to hardship and solitude. His family insisted that he would never willingly abandon them, yet he vanished without a single word or warning. That a man so familiar with the wilderness could disappear so completely added to the weight of the mystery. Those who knew him recall how months earlier he had taken a secret trip to Anchorage to buy Christmas presents for his children, returning quietly, armfuls of gifts in hand. He was a steady provider, careful and thoughtful, yet on that cold February day something inexplicable occurred. The same hands that held tools and gifts now left behind no trace except a few shallow footprints in snow, a vehicle abandoned in a snowbank, and the emptiness that followed. Speculation about what happened runs in all directions. Could hypothermia have claimed him within minutes? Did he fall into a hidden ravine or a river hidden beneath the snow? Some suggested foul play, imagining that someone more experienced in the wilderness could have intercepted him. Others whispered about eerie lights flickering through the forest that night, though no one could confirm their origin. The theories spread, each more unsettling than the last, but none offered certainty. His family and the community refused to surrender hope. They plastered missing person posters across the peninsula, organised ground and aerial searches, and enlisted volunteers familiar with the woods. Snow machiners followed frozen trails for miles, bush pilots combed the skies, and even divers checked frozen rivers. Every season the snow melted and returned, but nothing emerged to indicate his fate. Only questions remained, etched in the hearts of those who loved him. Years later, a wildfire swept across part of the Kenai Peninsula. Firefighters clearing charred woods found scattered human remains, a skull, half-burnt bones, remnants of clothing, and melted personal items. For a moment, hope flickered that Richard Hills might finally be found. DNA testing, however, confirmed that the remains belonged to a different man, missing since 2011. The discovery reopened old wounds and reminded the community how easily the Alaskan wilderness could erase human life without explanation. The passage of time has only deepened the mystery. The tracks, the truck, the empty snowbank all remain as ghostly relics along a frozen road. The forest has regrown, the snow has settled again, and the Kenai Peninsula continues to hold its secrets. For those who might venture there today under quiet winter skies, nothing marks the place where hills vanished. Not a signpost or marker, not even a disturbed patch of snow. Yet in the shifting shadows of the forest, where the wind whispers through spruce boughs and the river flows silently, one can feel the absence of a man who simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions and the lingering suggestion that the wilderness is capable of keeping its own. In the depths of the forest, under the snow, and through the lingering silence, Richard Hills may still be waiting to be found. The vanished camp of the Twin Lakes photographer. The first hint of the photographer's disappearance emerged not from the forest, but from the stillness of the lake itself, where nothing stirred and his campsite remained curiously intact. Twin Lakes, a remote stretch of water surrounded by dense forest and cragged ridges, had long been a favoured site for wildlife photographers seeking bears, moose, and the occasional migratory bird. Yet on that summer day in 2008, the serene landscape contrasted sharply with the human absence that marked the shoreline. No one had seen him leave, and no tracks suggested the path he might have taken. He had been known for careful preparation, unpacking cameras and lenses in deliberate order, a habit that made the sudden absence of motion all the more striking. Anyone who visited the area could recognise his meticulous approach. Tripods aligned for optimal framing, backpacks arranged to keep lenses safe from moisture, and food stored in precise locations to avoid attracting bears. These routines were habits born of experience, and they underscored the unsettling nature of what remained when the photographer vanished. Each piece of equipment rested exactly where it had been left, untouched and perfectly arranged, as if the moment of departure had been frozen in place. A sleeping bag lay neatly rolled, a portable stove remained beside a small stack of firewood, and food containers were unopened, their contents preserved. There was no evidence of a struggle or hurried exit. Even personal items, like a water bottle and a notebook, were positioned with a care that seemed deliberate. Yet no one could explain why the photographer would leave so completely without taking anything with him. The dense canopy of spruce and birch surrounded the shoreline, leaving dark, shifting shadows that blurred the edges of paths and concealed any signs of passage. Every step into the woods was met with the crunch of fallen needles and the occasional crack of a branch, yet no trace of him appeared beyond the immediate area of the camp. In a place where footprints in soft soil or snow might linger for days, the absence of a trail deepened the sense of the impossible. It was as though the forest itself had refused to reveal what had happened. Volunteers and officials combed trails, peered beneath overhanging branches, and scanned the lake's perimeter, yet no footprints or clues indicated where he might have gone. Local search and rescue teams, familiar with backcountry operations and the unpredictable nature of Alaskan wilderness, treated the situation with cautious hope, recalling past rescues where hikers or hunters were found days later, sometimes just beyond the range of initial searches. Here, though, even veteran trackers encountered nothing. No impressions in mud, no bent vegetation, not a single trace suggested the photographer's presence beyond the campsite. On a small rock near the tent, a journal lay open and undisturbed, while the camera remained on a tripod, still recording as though anticipating a return that would never come. The notebook contained routine notes about wildlife sightings and weather conditions, but the pages offered no hint of an impending disappearance. The camera, aimed at a cluster of spruce where a bear had been observed the previous day, captured nothing more than empty forest and sky. These items, ordinary in isolation, together amplified the strangeness of the scene. Life paused, but the person who animated it had disappeared entirely. Near the edge of the water, the photographer's small rowboat remained tied to a weathered dock, its paddle resting inside as though ready for immediate use. Observers noted faint scratches on the hull and a slight trail in the mud that led toward the lake but vanished after a few feet, suggesting a brief attempt to launch or reposition the boat that went unfinished. even the fishing net coiled neatly beside the vessel bore no signs of disturbance, reinforcing the notion that he'd left without intention to return, or perhaps had been interrupted in the middle of routine preparations. Unpredictable winds swept across the lake, stirring leaves and scattering pine needles, erasing the faintest signs of movement that might have guided searchers. Sunlight shifted over the water, reflecting off ripples in a way that made the shoreline appear constantly altered. Even the wildlife seemed aware of the unusual stillness. Birds that might normally fluttered from branch to branch remained in silent observation, and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake sounded unnervingly like a signal from a world indifferent to human concerns. The wilderness itself seemed to guard its secrets with quiet precision. Residents and visiting photographers recounted the area's quiet unpredictability, noting how the lake's reflective surface and surrounding woods could mask nearly any activity. Those who knew Twin Lakes understood that its beauty concealed peril. Hidden bogs, steep slopes, and thick brush could easily disorient anyone unprepared for the terrain. Despite this, the complete absence of evidence remained baffling. In a place where natural hazards existed but were generally navigable by experienced outdoor enthusiasts, the photographer's disappearance suggested something far more perplexing. Days turned into weeks, and the campsite stayed precisely as it had been found, each organised item deepening the sense of a presence that vanished without explanation. Local authorities continued periodic searches, while family and friends returned repeatedly, scanning the trees and lake edge for any indication of movement. Even after repeated aerial surveys and extended ground patrols, nothing emerged. The wilderness, normally a witness to human passage, had absorbed him entirely. Each untouched tool and perfectly folded tent seemed a monument to absence, leaving those who looked on with questions that offered no answers. Even the distant peaks seemed indifferent, their snow-dusted ridges silently observing a place where human routine had abruptly ceased. The surrounding forests, reflecting the sun at mid-afternoon and the moon at night, stood unchanging while the seasons passed. Nature continued its cycles without acknowledgement of a missing man who had once moved deliberately among its contours, leaving only traces of intention frozen in time. Among the dense woods, scattered shoreline, and unbroken stretches of wilderness, the photographer's presence remains a question without answer, as if the land itself has chosen to keep him hidden forever. The pilot who never reached Seward. The flight from Anchorage to Seward began like any other, routine and unremarkable, yet over the jagged expanse of the Kenai Mountains, the aircraft disappeared without a trace. On a clear morning in 1984, the seasoned bush pilot prepared for the journey with calm precision, checking instruments, communicating with local air traffic, and filing his usual flight plan. Seward, nestled on the edge of Resurrection Bay, was a familiar destination, yet the approach required navigating narrow mountain passes and unpredictable air currents that could challenge even the most experienced aviators. That day, a flight that should have been ordinary ended in silence that no search or investigation could explain. Veteran bush pilots described him as meticulous, someone who knew the Kenai Peninsula as intimately as the palms of his hands, and whose pre-flight checks were never hurried. He had flown these routes countless times, delivering mail, cargo, and passengers, and his reputation for skill and caution preceded him. Early morning light glinted off the snow-dusted ridges as he taxied and took off, engines humming with quiet confidence, a familiar sound to those observing the departure. His attention to detail in flight planning suggested nothing unusual, yet it was precisely this ordinary routine that made the subsequent disappearance so unsettling. The intended flight path followed well-known corridors between sharp ridges, icy glaciers, and shadowed valleys, threading through canyons where winds shifted abruptly and clouds could descend without warning. Rivers carved their way through hidden valleys, and high-altitude thermals could lift or buffet a small plane with little notice. Pilots navigating these paths relied on experience, maps, and visual cues to maintain orientation, yet even a minor lapse or an unexpected gust could create peril in an instant. On that day, the air remained clear, making the lack of any accident or forced landing all the more mystifying. The routine radio check came at 10:47 a.m., a calm, steady report of altitude, position, and estimated time of arrival, after which all communication ceased. Ground stations attempted repeated calls, while other pilots in the vicinity scanned the frequency for any response. Families and co-workers listened anxiously for even a faint reply, but nothing came. No distress signal, no indication of mechanical failure, only the abrupt end of contact with a flight that had followed its planned route with careful precision. Aerial searches began immediately, planes combing the known flight corridor while ground teams ventured into every accessible canyon and ridge. Helicopters circled glaciers, valleys and high passes, their crews scanning for signs of debris, a wingtip, or fragments of metal that might indicate a crash. Despite exhaustive efforts, searchers found nothing. Even seasoned bush pilots who assisted in the search acknowledged the perplexity. A fully operational plane flown by an experienced pilot should not have vanished without leaving some trace. The Kenai Mountains themselves seemed to absorb the aircraft. Narrow passes twisted between cliffs, while hidden valleys created blind spots for even the most thorough search. Sudden shifts in wind patterns and the way sunlight reflected off snow and ice made detection difficult from both air and ground. Streams and creeks ran swiftly, capable of carrying debris into hidden ravines. In a region so rugged, even a small misstep might be compounded by nature's obstacles, yet no evidence of any accident or landing was ever located. Along the planned route, a series of narrow ridgelines and deep glacial valleys created pockets where wind patterns could shift without warning, forming eddies and downdrafts that were nearly impossible to predict from the cockpit. Witnesses on the ground later recalled seeing the aircraft briefly outlined against the snow-capped peaks, then disappearing behind a ridge in a manner that suggested either an abrupt maneuver or the influence of turbulent air. Even the most seasoned pilots admitted that in this stretch of the Kenai Mountains, a small misjudgment in altitude or heading could send a plane into a hidden chasm or avalanche-prone slope, leaving no visible trace behind. The aircraft, a single-engine bush plane, was thoroughly maintained and well suited to the route. Its engine, instruments and fuel systems had been checked and approved before departure. The pilot's own experience reduced the likelihood of human error, reinforcing the mystery surrounding the disappearance. If mechanical failure occurred, it left no wreckage. If a forced landing was attempted, no trace of the plane was found in the valleys, on glacier surfaces, or among the tree lines. Every technical assessment only deepened the sense of impossibility. In response to the disappearance, authorities coordinated a massive search effort involving multiple aircraft, ground teams, and volunteer pilots familiar with the peninsula's unpredictable terrain. Communities along the flight path tracked progress with growing unease, sharing local knowledge about hidden valleys and potential hazards. The scale of the operation highlighted the gravity of the situation. A routine flight had produced a disappearance that seemed immune to explanation, confounding both aviation experts and those accustomed to the hazards of the Alaska Triangle. Time has done little to resolve the case, as follow-up surveys, aerial scans, and repeated attempts to locate the plane produce no new evidence. Flight records and witness accounts remain the only documented traces of the journey. The Kenai Mountains, with their concealed ravines and abrupt cliffs, continued their silent guardianship over a flight that should have been ordinary. The absence of any clue underscores how easily the wilderness can erase human presence, leaving questions that persist decades later. In the ridges and valleys long familiar with their daily storms and constant flights, silence persists over the vanished plane, as though the mountains themselves guard the secret. Winds that twist through narrow passes and snowfields that glint under the sun bear no record of the flight, no indication of a landing or crash, and no trace of the pilot who once skillfully navigated their corridors. Each peak and canyon remains unchanged, a stark contrast to the sudden absence that still puzzles those who search for answers. High above the ridges and hidden valleys, the pilot's fate lingers in the unyielding silence of the mountains, an enduring mystery that no search or calculation has yet resolved. The missing guide of Lake Clark Pass. Henry Walters had guided countless expeditions through Alaska's most remote wilderness, yet in 1971 the backcountry guide vanished in Lake Clark Pass during a routine scouting trip, leaving no trail for searchers to follow. Known among fellow guides for his reliability and extensive knowledge of the Alaskan interior, Walters set out alone, prepared to chart a corridor known for both its beauty and its hidden dangers. What should have been a straightforward assessment of the pass turned into one of the most perplexing disappearances in the Alaska Triangle, a case where even experience could not guarantee survival. Known for his meticulous planning and deep understanding of backcountry hazards, Walters packed supplies and mapped every segment of the pass, confident that experience could outmatch the mountains. His gear included insulated clothing, food rations, and basic signalling equipment, all intended to sustain him for days if necessary. Reports from colleagues suggest that he reviewed weather patterns, ice conditions, and potential avalanche zones before leaving, a methodical routine that made the sudden disappearance all the more baffling. The pass itself carved a jagged line between glaciers and cliffs, where narrow valleys funneled ice and snow into hidden pockets, creating terrain that challenged both navigation and endurance. Crevices could appear unexpectedly, and snowfields sometimes concealed unstable ground, turning what appeared to be a solid path into a hidden hazard. Streams running beneath glaciers could create treacherous ice bridges, while sheer cliff faces made lateral movement impossible in many areas. Even for a skilled guide like Walters, the topography demanded constant attention and caution. Storm reports indicated gusting winds and rapidly dropping temperatures on the day of his disappearance, conditions that could make familiar ridges unrecognizable and small errors unforgiving. Though the morning began with clear skies, the weather in Lake Clark Pass was notoriously changeable. Snow could fall in minutes, winds could shift direction, and low clouds might reduce visibility to near zero. In such moments, even seasoned guides could lose sight of the safest route, and survival could hinge on rapid adaptation to unpredictable circumstances. Before setting out, Walters had carefully studied topographical maps and historical weather logs for Lake Clark Pass, noting avalanche-prone slopes and icefalls along his intended route. He carried a portable compass, an altimeter, and a small radio, along with food caches strategically placed for longer excursions. Local guides later mentioned that he often paused to record terrain features, water sources, and potential campsite locations, practices meant to aid future parties and ensure safe passage through the region. Yet even with these precautions, the dynamic conditions of the pass could render all observations temporary, transforming familiar landmarks into deceptive hazards within minutes. On the glacier's approach, investigators noted the faint impressions of boot prints leading toward a glacier's edge, abruptly ending as if the snow had swallowed all evidence of further progress. No campsites, no discarded items, and no footprints continued beyond this point, leaving searchers with only a single line of inquiry: where had the guide gone, and what might have caused such a sudden cessation of tracks? Every minute detail documented by early search teams emphasized the abruptness of the disappearance, heightening the sense of the pass as a place capable of swallowing human presence entirely. Surveying the treacherous ridges and ravines, aerial reconnaissance combined with ground teams yielded no trace. The sweep was hampered by inaccessible terrain and the unpredictable weather that had likely claimed his path. Helicopters hovered over glaciers and cliffs, their crews scanning every shadow and crevice, while volunteers moved cautiously across narrow valleys. Each snowdrift and ice shelf presented both an obstacle and a potential hiding place for evidence, yet nothing was discovered. The mountains, it seemed, had kept their secret from even the most exhaustive search. Although equipped with a full complement of survival gear, including insulated clothing, provisions, and signaling devices, Walter's disappearance suggests that even preparedness could not overcome the sudden and extreme conditions of the pass. Guides familiar with the area recognized that a misstep into a hidden crevasse, an unexpected avalanche, or disorientation during a whiteout could render even the best equipment ineffective. The combination of remote location, steep terrain, and abrupt weather created an environment where a skilled individual might vanish without a trace. From the remote passes to the avalanche-prone slopes, local guides, authorities, and volunteers coordinated extensive searches, yet the mountains appeared to absorb the event entirely, leaving no confirmation of the guide's fate. Communities in nearby settlements offered knowledge of safe routes and hazards, while authorities attempted to map search grids to maximize coverage. Despite the manpower and expertise, the region's ruggedness limited the reach of human observation, reinforcing the perception of the pass as a corridor that could erase a person. To this day, the case remains unresolved, with no recovered equipment or sightings, preserving the passage's reputation as a corridor where the wilderness can erase the presence of even the most skilled travelers, Subsequent expeditions and surveys produced no new evidence, though occasional glimpses of boot prints or campsite remnants in nearby areas fueled speculation and renewed interest. The combination of harsh topography, sudden storms, and the absence of any recoverable trace has cemented the mystery as one of the Alaska Triangle's most perplexing incidents. Silent among the ridges and hollows, the landscape seems unchanged since that day, bearing silent witness to a disappearance that continues to puzzle investigators and unsettle those who traverse Lake Clark Pass. The icy wind whistles through narrow valleys, glaciers shift imperceptibly, and the snowfields remain both pristine and indifferent to human endeavour. Every year, hikers and guides enter the same corridors with caution, reminded of the guide who disappeared without a trace, a cautionary tale preserved by the very wilderness he knew so well. In the heart of the pass, where glaciers and cliffs meet in unbroken isolation, Henry Walter's fate remains one of the Alaska Triangle's most haunting enigmas. The vanishing of Daniel Roy Akey. Daniel Roy Akey drove into Chugach State Park on an ordinary morning in 2008, only to vanish within a few miles of the park entrance, leaving no trace of his passage or intentions. The park, popular for day hikers and nature enthusiasts, conceals a labyrinth of dense forests, creeks, and uneven terrain that can quickly turn even a short excursion into a perilous undertaking. On that day, what should have been a routine outing became one of the most baffling disappearances in the Alaska Triangle, a case that has perplexed searchers and locals alike. At 28, Akey was familiar with the city and the surrounding wilderness, often taking brief excursions into the park, but nothing in his routine suggested he would fail to return home that day. Friends described him as cautious yet curious, someone who appreciated both the solitude of the forest and the structured pace of urban life. His experience navigating backcountry trails would have been considered adequate for a short trek, making his disappearance all the more confounding and raising questions about what might have caused a sudden vanishing. The trail he intended to follow meandered through dense spruce and birch, crossing streams and uneven terrain that could conceal both natural obstacles and subtle signs of passage. Moss-covered rocks and fallen logs created hidden trip hazards, while thickets of underbrush obscured any potential footprints. Small clearings appeared at intervals, offering brief reprieves from the canopy, but these spots could also mislead a hiker into losing their sense of direction, particularly if weather conditions shifted or shadows distorted perception. Akey was known to carry a compact map and a small handheld GPS device, tools he trusted to navigate even the densest parts of Chugach State Park. Local hikers recalled seeing him meticulously note landmarks, water crossings, and fallen trees on previous trips, a habit that suggested both caution and an acute awareness of the park's shifting terrain. Despite these precautions, the forest's complexity, with narrow gullies, hidden ravines, and moss-covered slopes, could easily mislead even an experienced hiker, leaving faint tracks or equipment unnoticed. Park rangers and passing hikers reported glimpses of a lone figure near a small clearing, though by the time search teams arrived, the area appeared untouched, as if no one had walked there at all. These fleeting sightings were the last recorded indications of Akey's presence. When investigators surveyed the location hours later, the ground showed no traces of footwear, discarded items, or disturbed vegetation. The forest seemed to have reclaimed all evidence, leaving only the enduring question of where he went after those initial glimpses. Even in late summer, the forest presented hazards: hidden holes in moss-covered ground, sudden river swells from upstream runoff, and the persistent shadows that distorted perception and orientation. Seasonal rains could swell small streams into dangerous currents in moments, and fallen trees or unstable ground could conceal hazards that a hiker might not notice until it was too late. Though the park is heavily trafficked in some areas, the backtrails Akey may have chosen offered little visibility and ample opportunities for disorientation. Local topographers and experienced hikers noted that even short excursions in Chugach State Park can be deceptive, with deceptively gentle slopes masking sudden drops or hidden bogs that can trap a person's footing without warning. In addition, the park's intricate network of tributaries and seasonal meltwater channels can shift rapidly, erasing tracks or altering familiar landmarks in hours. These subtle transformations mean that a hiker like Akey, despite experience and caution, could traverse the same route countless times, yet still encounter conditions that render each journey unpredictable and perilous. Seasonal wildlife may have also played a subtle role in obscuring traces. Tracks of moose, foxes or bears occasionally crisscross the back trails, erasing or confusing human footprints, while small scavengers can quickly scatter unattended gear. The interplay of natural forces, river currents, fallen branches and wildlife activity can render a once clear trail indistinguishable from untouched forest within hours, leaving search teams with few reliable indicators of directional movement. In the maze of forested paths, authorities mobilized quickly, combining ground searches with canine units and limited aerial reconnaissance, yet the undergrowth and labyrinthine trails hampered efforts to locate any sign of AK. Teams carefully mapped and swept the area, moving in coordinated grids through thick forest and along winding creek beds. But even with modern search methods, the terrain proved stubbornly unyielding. Helicopters scanned from above, but dense canopy and shadowed ravines offered near-perfect concealment, making the forest both witness and accomplice in the disappearance. No personal items, footprints or disturbed vegetation were discovered, leaving investigators with only speculation about the final moments before his disappearance, though all theories remain unconfirmed. Some considered the possibility of a sudden accident, a fall into a hidden depression, or becoming lost in the undergrowth. Others noted the puzzling lack of any evidence suggesting a struggle or emergency attempt to signal for help. The absence of physical clues deepened the mystery, transforming a routine day hike into a case that defied conventional explanation. Family, friends and residents joined in the search over subsequent days, their concern amplified by the park's reputation for sudden hazards despite its popularity among hikers. Volunteers traced trails, waded along creeks, and carefully examined secluded areas where someone might have sought temporary refuge. Despite the collective effort, the search yielded nothing, reinforcing the sense that the forest had absorbed Aki completely, leaving only silence in his wake. More than a decade has passed, yet the disappearance remains unresolved, a persistent enigma that underscores the unpredictable nature of wilderness excursions in the Alaska Triangle. Occasional reports of footprints or shadows rekindle brief hope, but no verifiable evidence has ever surfaced. The forest itself continues largely unchanged, maintaining the same treacherous combination of beauty and concealment that may have contributed to Aki's sudden vanishing. Every trail, creek and ridge in that section of the park now carries a silent reminder of Aki's unexplained vanishing, cautioning those who enter that familiarity offers no guarantee of safety. Hikers moving through the same paths speak of an unsettling stillness in certain areas, a quiet that feels thicker than the ordinary forest, and a subtle awareness that something once present might have left without a trace. In the quiet of the forest where paths twist and streams obscure the ground beneath, Daniel Roy Aki's fate lingers as one of the Alaska Triangle's most enduring mysteries. The Lost Prospectors of Valdez Creek. The roar of Valdez Creek filled the valley, masking the sudden stillness of a campsite where two prospectors had vanished without a trace. In 1979, the men had been working the creek's remote stretches, panning for gold and mapping potential claim sites, yet the tools and tents they left behind suggested a meticulous routine abruptly interrupted. The area lies within the Alaska Triangle, where rugged terrain, sudden weather shifts, and dense forests make even short excursions perilous, and where countless disappearances have been documented without explanation. Experienced in the unpredictable rhythms of the Alaskan wilderness, the missing men carried the careful habits of seasoned prospectors, yet even these routines offered no protection against the unknown. Locals recalled that the men had spent years prospecting in the region, familiar with its rocky beds, thick brush, and the seasonal surges of creek waters. Friends and fellow miners remembered them as diligent, disciplined, and methodical, the type who would not leave a campsite unsecured or venture into hazardous terrain without caution. Their tools and pans were arranged with meticulous care, untouched and aligned as if the men had paused mid-task, leaving no sign of struggle or disorder behind. Shovels rested against logs, sluice boxes were emptied and stacked neatly, and food caches were undisturbed, sealed in waterproof containers. This degree of orderliness only deepened the mystery, suggesting that whatever occurred happened suddenly without warning and without time for the men to react or signal for help. Dense stands of spruce and alder encroached on the narrow creek corridor, creating hidden pockets of shadow and concealed depressions where even a cautious hiker might vanish from view. Fallen branches, moss-covered rocks, and hidden gullies made footing precarious, and shifting creek currents occasionally cut new channels that could mask signs of passage. The forest in this region is deceptively quiet, yet beneath its calm veneer lies a labyrinth of natural hazards capable of frustrating even the most experienced outdoorsman. The creek itself is notorious for sudden surges, even in late summer, when snowmelt or upstream rainfall can swell its banks within hours. These flash rises often create temporary channels and submerged obstacles that can disorient travellers, washing away fragile tracks and sweeping loose gear downstream. For prospectors navigating the narrow banks and rocky ledges, a single misstep could lead not only to injury, but also to disappearance in sections of the creek that are difficult to access or even spot from higher ground. Those who had seen the men last described them following a minor tributary upstream, yet the path yielded no footprints or displaced vegetation to suggest the direction they had taken. Local miners noted that the creek and its tributaries change rapidly with runoff from melting snow or sudden rains, meaning that tracks could disappear within hours. The terrain's unevenness, coupled with narrow, shadowed channels, could easily obscure the presence of two men walking through the wilderness, leaving searchers with little to follow. Search parties moved through the thickets and along the riverbanks in coordinated sweeps, but each sweep returned empty-handed, leaving only questions in the wake of their absence. Volunteers and local authorities combed the forest in grids, examined the rocky slopes and scanned the creeks, while dogs and trackers attempted to detect any scent trail. Despite these efforts, the search produced no evidence. No footprints, no discarded items, no disturbances in the environment that could indicate where the men had gone. The forest quiet could mislead the senses, with sudden changes in water flow, fallen branches, and wildlife activity quickly erasing any trace of human presence. Tracks of moose, foxes or bears frequently cross the creek's narrow paths, and scavengers can scatter unattended gear in minutes. Even an experienced prospector's careful movement could be rendered invisible within hours, leaving investigators with only the knowledge that the men had disappeared without a trace. Equipment left behind at the site hinted at the prospector's last intentions. One pan was slightly filled with sediment, a shovel rested in the creek bed, and a small journal lay open on a flat rock. These subtle clues suggested that they had paused mid-task, perhaps to examine a promising gold vein or to navigate the treacherous terrain, but they never returned to complete even the simplest routine. For investigators, these signs added another layer of intrigue, indicating conscious, deliberate movement immediately before vanishing rather than sudden panic or accident at camp. Valdez Creek has a long history of solitary prospecting, its isolation and natural hazards challenging even those familiar with the terrain and contributing to countless unexplained disappearances over the decades. Miners often spent weeks at a time in remote camps, navigating the dense forest and unpredictable waterways alone or in pairs, with limited communication to the outside world. This culture of independence and isolation, combined with the creek's natural dangers, helps explain why even experienced prospectors can vanish from the land without leaving evidence. Generations of locals still recall the story of the missing men, and modern hikers sometimes speak of strange sensations along the trail, as if the forest itself retains a memory of their passage. Occasional searches have been mounted in the decades since, yet the men have never been found, and no reliable evidence has emerged to clarify their fate. Stories of the creek's treacherous channels and the forest's ability to conceal both humans and wildlife add to the enduring intrigue. Every rock, hollow and bend in the creek now holds the weight of unspoken questions, silent testimony to the forest's capacity for concealment. Even today, the site evokes a quiet caution for those who venture into its depths, a reminder that the land's beauty can mask its dangers and that the line between presence and absence can be as narrow as a shadowed trail. Decades later, the lost prospectors remained swallowed by the land they sought to tame, leaving only speculation and the murmur of Valdez Creek behind. The unfinished mail run of Thomas Moore. A brittle quietness settled across interior Alaska during the early months of 1974, the kind that made even busy crossroads feel suspended in their own frozen stillness as winter clung to the landscape with a deliberate weight. It was during this season that the mail carrier Thomas Moore prepared for another delivery run, a routine route that wound through remote terrain where isolated homesteads depended on his reliability more than most modern towns might ever understand. Moore had travelled these paths countless times before, trusting the rhythms of the land as surely as the residents trusted him. His disappearance along that familiar stretch would soon become one of the most persistent uncertainties connected to the Alaskan Triangle. Not long after he set out that morning from the small settlement where his deliveries began, the weather exhibited one of its abrupt shifts, pressing a heavy sheet of haze against the low-lying valleys that framed the mail trail. Residents accustomed to these changes later described a soft distortion to the light, as though each ridge lacked its usual definition, making every slope appear subtly unmoored. Snow grains drifted through the air in faint spirals, soft enough to disguise their accumulation but heavy enough to reshape the edges of the trail. The mailbag he carried, routine in weight and content, was never recovered, leaving investigators with no physical timeline to reconstruct. What followed was a search effort that drew in neighbours familiar with the path Moore travelled, experienced trackers from nearby communities, and state officials determined to cover the key segments of his route before the conditions deteriorated further. Snowdrifts along narrow passes had already sealed sections of the trail, forcing crews to adapt by tracing secondary routes that wound over deeper ridgelines. The group moved methodically, probing snowbanks for collapse patterns and scanning tree wells for signs of forced passage. Despite the coordinated effort, no tracks, no clothing remnants, and no disrupted snowfields appeared, details that, under ordinary circumstances, would have created at least a starting point. Additional speculation emerged when a pair of trappers who frequented a nearby creek mentioned hearing the faint hum of an engine on the afternoon Moore vanished, though no aircraft had been logged in the area that day. Their account fueled questions about echoes bouncing across the corridor, where sound behaved unpredictably in winter and often travelled farther than expected. Investigators recorded their testimony out of due diligence, aware that auditory distortions were common in the region, especially with cloud cover pressing low above the valley. Without corroborating evidence or radar confirmation, the anomaly remained a curiosity rather than a breakthrough. Further uncertainty arose when search teams reached a narrow saddle known for unpredictable gusts that could easily disorient travellers unfamiliar with the terrain. Individuals who had crossed it during storms described how quickly visibility collapsed from clear to opaque, reducing the world to a shifting blur of white that erased perspective. Crews traced both approaches to the saddle, judging wind directions and scanning the contours where snow typically accumulated against the rocks. Despite extensive examination, no sign indicated that Moore ever entered the passage, raising the possibility that he altered course somewhere earlier without leaving any visible trace. Another layer of confusion settled when searchers examined a small stand of spruce trees where storm debris often collected after heavy winds. Strands of broken branches lay scattered, but none showed markings consistent with a person forcing passage through the area, and the snow beneath them held no impressions. The absence of evidence felt almost intentional, as if the landscape itself declined to record movement on the day Moore vanished. Officials noted this anomaly in their reports, though it proved no more conclusive than the other fragments they had gathered. Farther upslope, investigators reached a wind-scoured clearing once used as a temporary waypoint by mail carriers during difficult winters, a place where older delivery logs noted occasional delays caused by sudden ground blizzards. Hoping that Moore might have paused there before conditions worsened, searchers sifted through packed snow layers for signs of disturbed crust, scattered equipment, or even a partially shielded indentation. Nothing surfaced, not a buried strap, not a torn scrap of canvas, yet the clearing's history raised questions about whether Moore had aimed for this sheltered rise and simply never arrived. Close to a frozen stream that fed into a large drainage, a set of animal tracks emerged. Wolf by the shape and depth, yet their pattern suggested they had been moving undisturbed long after Moore disappeared. Searchers initially paused at the possibility that wildlife might have intersected his route, but the timing did not align, and the tracks ultimately provided context rather than clues. The stream's brittle surface, however, hinted at rapid temperature shifts that week, raising questions about whether sudden thawing and refreezing might have concealed temporary openings, yet no fracture lines or pressure ridges indicated a collapse. Beyond the icy stream bed, Search teams reached an overlooked ridge where telegraph crews once maintained a primitive relay station before it fell out of use in the mid-20th century, leaving only foundation stones buried beneath seasonal drifts. The ridge had occasionally appeared in route notes used by frontier-era couriers who favoured the elevation during heavy fog, believing the height granted better visibility. Modern investigators examined the area for any sign Moore might have attempted a similar detour, yet the drift lines remained smooth and untouched, suggesting that even this quiet historical landmark had not witnessed his passing. Investigators later reviewed accounts from residents living along one of the alternate paths Moore occasionally used when storms intensified, though none recalled hearing unusual disturbances or seeing his sled approach. One cabin owner mentioned noticing an absence, the kind that feels like something expected never arrived, but could not identify a specific hour or event connected to the feeling. Such impressions were noted as human but unreliable, included only because the disappearance had unsettled even those who typically trusted their instincts in harsh conditions. The lack of concrete recollection reinforced how silent the landscape had been that day. Along a shallow bench further west, searchers encountered an abandoned supply cache, used intermittently by trappers during winters when deep storms made travel unpredictable, its battered wooden lid frozen shut beneath a veneer of wind-hardened snow. Crews pried it open in the hope that Moore, familiar with many of these old cache locations, might have taken temporary refuge inside, but the interior held only brittle scraps of wrapping paper, a rusted tin, and the undisturbed stillness of long neglect. The discovery reinforced how many potential lifelines remained untouched, as though every option he might have chosen simply went unused. Attention eventually turned to the possibility that Moore had attempted to navigate around a low-lying basin, notorious for trapping fog, a pocket of air where horizon lines dissolved into indistinguishable pallor. Travellers familiar with the region spoke of how easily orientation could slip there, especially when landmarks merged into a seamless wash of white. Searchers devoted hours to probing the basin's perimeter, yet the snowfield remained pristine, refusing to offer any indication that Moore or his sled ever crossed through. The featureless terrain made even seasoned trackers uneasy, as though whatever passed through left no trace by design. Efforts continued through the following week with methodical sweeps that extended farther than the limits of Moore's regular route, mapping out every plausible deviation he might have chosen in deteriorating conditions. Teams documented subtle irregularities in the terrain, unusual drifts, collapsed overhangs and wind-scoured openings, but none bore signs of recent human presence. The disappearance settled slowly into the growing archive of Alaskan Triangle tragedies, marked not by dramatic evidence but by a quiet absence that resisted explanation and overshadowed every official report filed afterward. In the end, the unanswered question that lingered over every report was not merely where Thomas Moore had gone, but why the land he travelled so faithfully held no memory of his final passage. The disappearance of the Hooper Bay snow machine duo. Conversations in Hooper Bay still recall the day two snow machine riders set out on what should have been a predictable winter crossing. In 2010, the lifelong friends departed from the outskirts of the small coastal community under clear skies and steady cold, planning to cover familiar terrain between the village and inland hunting grounds. Their departure carried the same quiet confidence with which they had undertaken countless trips, yet as hours passed without return, what was ordinary became immediately alarming. No distress calls reached the local radio station, and their families soon realised the familiar rhythm of their travels had been interrupted by something entirely unknown. Stories about their departure emphasise how ordinary the decision had seemed, marked only by the quiet confidence of men familiar with the trail ahead. Local hunters later recalled seeing the duo meticulously checking fuel lines, adjusting helmets, and fastening radios to their snow machines, actions so routine that no passerby would have suspected danger. Their machines were high-powered, meticulously maintained, and capable of traversing frozen rivers and drifting tundra with ease. Despite all preparations, the disappearance unfolded like a puzzle missing its final pieces, leaving investigators to wonder how such capable travellers could vanish into the winter's expanse. Those who followed their route later noted how quickly routine travel can shift into uncertainty when familiar points of reference fail to appear where they should. Tracks that should have been clearly visible in the snow disappeared abruptly at a shallow rise, leaving nothing beyond a faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the surface. Even careful inspection revealed no mechanical debris, no marks of a forced stop, and no trace of human movement beyond the initial segments. Observers later described the sensation of tracing invisible footprints, as if the riders had simply ceased to exist once their machines crested a minor incline, leaving an unresolved corridor of uncertainty behind them. Word of their absence moved through households in a gradual ripple, prompting small groups to compare timelines and distances in hopes of identifying where the pair may have slowed or stopped. Conversations revealed a mixture of practical calculations and instinctive fears. How long could two experienced riders traverse the inland route before becoming overdue, and what factors might prevent a simple return? Radio checks confirmed no signals had been sent, and repeated battery inspections revealed no evidence of malfunction. The quiet anxiety deepened as neighbours considered the impossibility of two well-prepared men disappearing so completely in territory they had travelled countless times. Search volunteers began their work by retracing every segment the riders were known to frequent, relying as much on shared memory as on physical evidence. Teams covered frozen river crossings, wooded hollows, and gently sloped rises connecting the village to interior trails, often encountering subtle snowdrifts that erased tracks almost as soon as they appeared. Each discovery, slight depressions, scuffed snow patches, minor displaced branches, suggested human presence without confirming it. Volunteers reported a sense of being watched or accompanied by silence itself, a lingering tension that left even the most experienced trackers unsettled. Early findings introduced complications rather than clarity, as scattered impressions hinted at movement without revealing a continuous track. Some impressions suggested a short pause, possibly for equipment adjustments or interaction with wildlife, yet no items were found to corroborate these assumptions. Wildlife activity, foxes, hares, or migrating birds had left overlapping marks, further obscuring possible human traces. The paradox grew. The landscape recorded hints of passage but no definitive evidence, creating an almost spectral quality to the disappearance. Investigators broadened their focus after realizing that the duo might have diverted from established routes, a possibility shaped by past incidents involving sudden disorientation or unexpected snowdrifts. Hooper Bay's interior terrain includes subtle rises, shallow depressions, and partially frozen channels that can confound even experienced riders. Teams scanned alternate pathways, considering the risk of hidden gullies or drifted basins, yet the snow remained pristine. Any deviation, if it occurred, had left no detectable mark, as if the snow itself had swallowed the traveller's passage without a trace. Among those analysing the case, several theories gained traction not through speculation, but through comparisons to earlier disappearances that showed similar patterns of vanishing without a trace. Some drew connections to other Alaska Triangle incidents, where hikers, pilots, and hunters had disappeared under conditions that left minimal physical evidence. Others explored the concept of microclimates, how sudden, localized gusts, sunlight reflections on ice, or hidden drifts could disorient even the most confident travelers. While these hypotheses offered context, they failed to explain the total erasure, deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. As days stretched into weeks, the community continued discussing the disappearance in measured tones, aware that the passage of time offered fewer chances for recovery. Volunteers and families adjusted daily routines to accommodate continued searches, exploring areas far beyond the route initially planned. Reports from aerial reconnaissance and ground sweeps produced fragments, faint impressions, disturbed snow, or branches shifted by wind, yet none directly tied to the missing riders. Each attempt seemed to reinforce the eerie pattern common to Alaska Triangle disappearances, in which absence itself became the most tangible evidence. Even after search efforts ended, the unresolved nature of the case continued to unsettle residents, who struggled to reconcile the vast openness of the region with the final unbroken silence left behind. Memories of the duo's confidence, meticulous preparation, and routine behaviour now blended with the inconceivable reality that they had simply disappeared. For those who witnessed the initial departure, the enduring question was not whether the men were lost, but how a familiar path could erase two individuals so completely, leaving only the quiet as testimony. In the emptiness beyond Hooper Bay, a frozen echo lingers, marking a journey that no search has yet managed to recover or explain. The missing boat of the Port Graham fishermen. The small harbour of Port Graham stirred with quiet activity that morning, the scent of salt and diesel blending as the fisherman prepared his skiff for the routine run that would soon vanish into the Alaska Triangle. In 1997, the man, seasoned by decades of navigating the rugged coastal waters of the Kenai Peninsula, had grown intimately familiar with every inlet, shoal and tide pattern near his village. Yet despite his skill, something would interrupt this ordinary morning, leaving the vessel he depended on to drift in silent isolation, engine still running, as though the sea itself had claimed him without a trace. Carefully checking nets and lines, he followed a pattern repeated for decades, ensuring every hook, rope and engine gauge aligned perfectly before gliding toward the open waters where salmon had begun their seasonal movement. The skiff's hull bore the wear of countless runs, the aluminum edges scored from ice and rocks, yet everything appeared seaworthy, poised for a day of work that, to any observer, promised nothing but routine. Neighbours recalled seeing him depart in good weather, with a light breeze carrying the briny air across the bay and the sun reflecting off the calm surface, highlighting the ordinary beginnings that would contrast so sharply with the extraordinary outcome. The skiff cut a steady line through the narrow inlet, its wake dissolving among rising tides, while gulls wheeled above, their cries a fleeting soundtrack to a journey that would never be completed. From the shore, the fisherman appeared as he always had, methodical, deliberate, and entirely in command of his craft, yet the Alaska Triangle's reputation for vanishing individuals would soon claim him, quietly and without warning. As the morning stretched toward noon, the water retained an almost reflective stillness, a deceptive calm that concealed the disappearance occurring just beyond human observation. Hours later, neighbours noticed the vessel drifting unnaturally near a secluded cove, engine still humming, gear untouched, and no sign of the man who should have been at its helm. The fishing nets were stacked neatly, personal items accounted for, and no clothing or equipment had been moved from their secured positions. The skiff's solitary presence defied explanation. In any ordinary circumstance, such an arrangement would suggest a sudden departure nearby, yet no footprints, no rope marks on shore, and no disturbance of driftwood or snow along the coastline were present. Search crews mobilized quickly, threading through channels and inlets familiar to the fishermen, yet the waters refused to surrender any trace beyond the empty skiff, leaving investigators baffled by the absence of debris or footprints. Small boats from neighbouring villages patrolled every plausible route, sonar and visual sweeps scanning for submerged signs, while Coast Guard vessels coordinated over larger expanses of the bay. Despite these efforts, the only evidence recovered was the skiff itself, floating with its engine idling as though awaiting an operator who had simply vanished into thin air. Currents and sudden gusts along the coastline created patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sea had shifted evidence out of reach, erasing the path of a person who had once been so present on its surface. Experienced locals noted how quickly tides could alter the shoreline and obscure tracks, yet even after repeated sweeps, investigators found no waterborne debris, overturned fishing gear, or signs of mechanical failure. In a region where nature's unpredictability was routine, this absence of disruption only magnified the mystery. Residents recalled the silence that settled after the discovery, a kind of expectancy that something should have appeared but never did, reinforcing the eerie void left by the missing fisherman. Family and neighbours organised informal searches, combing tidal flats, shallow bays and adjacent coves on foot, yet every effort ended with the same haunting result: an empty skiff, a calm sea, and no hint of human presence. Conversations among locals shifted from concern to quiet speculation, their observations layered with the unease that accompanies a disappearance in the Alaska Triangle, where explanations often dissolve under the weight of uncertainty. Even when aerial searches expanded beyond immediate waters, anomalies persisted: floating kelp in improbable arrangements, shifting drift ice, and currents that contradicted normal tidal expectations, offering perplexing hints without explanation. Pilots and observers recorded these irregularities, noting that none followed logical patterns that could suggest a drift path for the missing man. In the minds of investigators, the incongruities reinforced the idea that something beyond ordinary accident or misjudgment might have occurred, though no concrete evidence ever substantiated any theory. In the context of the Alaska Triangle, his disappearance became another instance where maritime expertise offered no protection, a reminder that even seasoned navigators could be swallowed by the region's enigmatic forces. Historical records of the Triangle reference similar vanishing acts, from bush pilots to lone hikers, but few involved watercraft with such deliberate precision abandoned mid-task. The skiff's idling engine, unaltered position, and absence of the fisherman became a silent symbol of the Triangle's unexplained tendencies, where human skill and routine fail to guarantee safety. Weeks later, the empty skiff remained tethered to its mooring in local memory and official records alike, a silent emblem of uncertainty as investigators catalogued the peculiar absence of anything definitive. The case persisted in local law referenced in Coast Guard reports and studied by maritime enthusiasts who traced tides and currents to explain the anomaly. Yet even with modern equipment and decades of experience, the simplest question remained unanswered. How could a man vanish completely while leaving the vessel he trusted in perfect, operable condition? No one would ever explain how a skilled fisherman, known for reading tides and weather, could vanish entirely while leaving the simplest of vessels seemingly untouched. The vanished anchorage camper. The quiet edges of Eklutna Lake had always drawn solitary campers, yet on one crisp summer evening in 2006, a familiar routine was shattered when a lone adventurer disappeared without explanation. The camper, whose name became associated with the incident in local reports, had arrived late the previous afternoon, carrying gear familiar to anyone who'd spent time in Alaska's backcountry: a modest tent, a sleeping bag, and a small supply of provisions sufficient for a short excursion. Friends described the outing as ordinary, a weekend retreat meant for reflection and solitude, yet the evening ended with a mystery that would perplex investigators and locals alike for years to come. The campsite itself bore the hallmarks of careful preparation: a small, taut tent pitched near the water's edge, a neatly arranged sleeping bag, and a fire smouldering low beneath a ring of stones. Supplies were stacked with deliberate order, with no items left scattered or damaged, suggesting the camper had followed routines that emphasized safety and organization. Fishing equipment rested beside the tent, and a backpack remained propped against a nearby log, untouched since the day's setup. The scene conveyed a sense of methodical planning, which only amplified the strangeness when no one returned from it. Morning brought the first unsettling sign: an unrolled sleeping bag, a fire still faintly smoking, and personal belongings left untouched, as if the camper had simply vanished into the thin air around them. The discovery was made by hikers who regularly used the trail that passed the lakeshore. Their initial assumption was that the camper had walked to a nearby store or cabin, yet the absence of footprints or signs of departure immediately suggested something far less ordinary. Even the carefully packed gear and provisions offered no indication that the camper had planned to leave deliberately. Local rangers and friends quickly mobilized, combing nearby trails and shoreline in hopes of discovering even the smallest clue. But the initial sweep revealed only undisturbed soil and subtle impressions of wildlife. Teams split into coordinated sections, searching along ridges, tree lines, and hidden inlets of the lake, where the shallow water met narrow strips of sand and gravel. Despite the thorough coverage, there was no trace of human passage beyond the campsite, no footprints leading away, and no signs of struggle. The absence became a defining characteristic of the mystery. Attention turned to the subtle signs of nature, a series of small animal tracks that curved around the tent but showed no evidence of human interaction, and wind patterns that could have erased faint impressions almost immediately. Observers noted how the forest and lakeshore could transform rapidly under natural conditions. The gentle shifting of a breeze could obscure a path in minutes, and scattered rainfall overnight could erase even the most obvious tracks. Yet even with these variables considered, the lack of any human trace remained confounding, as if the camper had dissolved into the landscape itself. At the campsite, investigators carefully documented the scene, photographing every detail and scanning the perimeter for footprints or drag marks, yet every measure returned the same unnerving result: no trace of the missing camper. Notes recorded precise locations of rocks, logs, and disturbed earth, while officers used measuring tapes and grids to assess potential escape routes. Canines trained to detect human scent were brought to the area, yet even their responses failed to yield actionable leads. The meticulous process highlighted the precision of the disappearance. No detail suggested a natural explanation or human error that could account for it. Speculation grew as officials weighed potential scenarios, from disorientation in the dense spruce forest to encounters with wildlife, though each hypothesis faltered under scrutiny, leaving the disappearance unresolved. Local hunters and experienced campers offered insights into what could happen when a person strays from a trail, noting hazards such as hidden creeks, uneven terrain, and sudden drop-offs, but none of these explained why no physical evidence remained. Theories involving voluntary departure were discounted by those who knew the campers' habits, emphasizing the unlikelihood of leaving all possessions behind. A distant hiker reported hearing what sounded like a call echoing across the trees, but when search teams traced the report, no evidence confirmed any unusual presence, further deepening the sense of an inexplicable void. The account was carefully logged, and surveyors attempted to map acoustic patterns in the area, aware of how the valley's topography could distort sound. Despite these efforts, the event offered no clues, only reinforcing the unsettling notion that the environment seemed to absorb rather than reveal what had occurred. Employing helicopters and canine units, search operations expanded over several days to examine rugged trails, steep banks, and shadowed hollows. Crews meticulously scanned the lake's perimeter, peering into dense groves where sunlight barely touched the ground and examining ledges where a fall might have gone unnoticed. Snowfields on higher ridges, while minimal for summer, and soft sand along the lakeshore were combed carefully, yet every search concluded with the same conclusion. The camper had left no trace behind. The forest, the water, and the rocky slopes had preserved an absence that no method could penetrate. Even as the investigation concluded its official search, the absence lingered, a precise and impenetrable silence that refused to yield to maps, measurements, or speculation. Locals spoke quietly of how the lake seemed to remember the presence of a solitary visitor but not his departure, a void that held onto stillness as much as the land itself. The episode became a subject of whispered stories, a mystery that fit seamlessly into the unsettling pattern of disappearances associated with the Alaskan Triangle, where the ordinary became inexplicably extraordinary. In Alaska's untouched expanse, where forests stretch endlessly and lakes reflect the heavens, the camper's disappearance remains an unsolved trace, as though the wilderness itself has decided to keep it secret. The disappearance of the Lost Lake Runner. A familiar route through the Lost Lake Trail became the stage for one of the most confounding mysteries in the Alaska Triangle when a trail runner vanished without warning in 2014. The disappearance of this experienced athlete, known for her meticulous preparation and familiarity with the area, defied explanation, leaving authorities and fellow runners with only fragments of a story that seemed to evaporate into the wilderness. The trail itself, a mixture of rolling terrain, thick forested sections, and clear stretches alongside the lake, offered no clues, as though the landscape had swallowed her presence entirely. On the morning of the run, the weather was deceptively benign. Clear skies and calm winds suggested a routine training session, yet subtle anomalies were noted by hikers later that day. A slight fog bank clinging to depressions in the trail, and a faint ripple across the lake that some described as uncharacteristic given the stillness. The runner's GPS device transmitted location points up to a certain junction before the signal ceased entirely, a sudden cessation that coincided with terrain neither particularly steep nor hazardous, deepening the puzzle for those trying to understand her disappearance. Early search efforts concentrated on the sections immediately surrounding the GPS cutoff. Teams meticulously combed the trail, examining undergrowth, shallow stream crossings, and the lake's shoreline for signs of passage. Despite these efforts, they found only minor disturbances in the soil and scattered pine needles, subtle anomalies that could have been caused by animals, fallen branches, or even the wind. There were no footprints, no discarded gear, and no sign that she'd deviated into the denser forest, leaving investigators to speculate whether the runner had somehow moved beyond detectable limits almost instantly. Search teams also investigated the trail's lesser-known side routes, narrow spurs that branched off into dense undergrowth or skirted shallow marshes. These areas, rarely traversed even by locals, revealed subtle patterns of soil compression and displaced leaves that suggested a small figure may have entered briefly before returning to the main path. Nothing definitive emerged. No personal items or footprints remained, but the evidence hinted at a deviation that might explain the sudden loss of GPS contact, intensifying the sense that she'd stepped into a space the trail itself seemed unwilling to acknowledge. Local wildlife patterns offered another layer of complexity. Rangers noted that several moose herds and lynx territories intersected sections of the Lost Lake Trail near the GPS cutoff point, areas usually avoided by humans but frequently traversed by these animals. While no animal tracks directly overlapped the runner's known path, the presence of fresh droppings and disrupted undergrowth suggested recent movement in the forest that could obscure human footprints. Investigators considered whether the runner might have temporarily diverted along these zones, unknowingly entering regions where terrain and wildlife activity erased almost any trace of passage. Witness accounts were sparse. A lone hiker reported glimpsing a figure moving quickly through a clearing, though the momentary sighting occurred at a distance too great to confirm identity. Another mentioned hearing rhythmic footsteps echoing through a canyoned section, but the sounds vanished as abruptly as they had begun, leaving only the faint impression of human presence. These fleeting moments, while inconclusive, reinforced the eerie notion that the runner had entered a zone in which normal perception and terrain seemed to behave unpredictably. The physical characteristics of the trail itself complicated the search. Moss-covered logs, intermittent rocky outcrops, and dense brush created natural barriers, yet none were significant enough to halt a trained runner. Investigators noted that the GPS device had sufficient battery life to have transmitted further along the route, implying the interruption was caused either by an abrupt environmental interference or a sudden departure from the main path. These anomalies deepened the sense of unease, hinting at forces within the environment that defied immediate explanation. Attention also turned to the trail's natural acoustics, which could warp perception in the forested corridors surrounding Lost Lake. Team members noted that winds funneled through specific valleys, creating phantom echoes of footsteps or distant voices, and shallow hollows sometimes magnified minor sounds into disorienting crescendos. In the context of the disappearance, these phenomena raised questions about whether the runner could have misjudged a junction or responded to a sound that led her away from the main trail, leaving no trace and rendering the familiar environment suddenly alien. Psychological factors were considered alongside physical ones. Even seasoned athletes are vulnerable to disorientation in areas where landmarks merge into homogeneous patterns of trees and snow, and where the interplay of light and shadow can mislead the eye. The runner's experience and preparedness made a navigational error seem unlikely, yet the complete absence of evidence suggested a scenario in which the usual rules of orientation might have been disrupted, as though the landscape itself had temporarily rewritten the paths it contained. Drone reconnaissance and aerial surveys added new perspectives, yet failed to produce solid leads. The canopy of the forest, combined with steep embankments and shadows cast by ridgelines, created hidden pockets where a person could theoretically move undetected, though nothing of substance was observed. Analysts reviewed flight paths and photographic grids meticulously, but the images yielded only vague textures and patterns in foliage, reinforcing the sense that whatever had occurred was deliberately invisible to standard observation techniques. Experts in search and rescue were confounded by the absence of footprints or disturbances near water crossings and stream fords, locations that, under normal circumstances, would retain tracks even in light snow or damp soil. The lack of such evidence meant that either she had been lifted from the environment in some extraordinary way, or that movement had occurred in a manner leaving no record, a scenario that left both authorities and family grasping at possibilities that ranged from environmental anomalies to more inexplicable interventions. As days turned into weeks, the disappearance became emblematic of the broader mysteries associated with the Alaska Triangle, where even familiar terrain could transform into a labyrinth of uncertainty. Each search, each investigation, and each theory failed to illuminate her fate, leaving behind only the silence of the trail, the gentle lapping of the lake, and the faintest whispers of something beyond comprehension. The Lost Lake Trail retained its quiet secret, and no footprint, no whisper, and no signal has yet revealed what truly happened to the runner who vanished within it.